Chapter 29:17. For Luo Fan, even if he knew about it, it would not be of much use. However, for the will of heaven and earth, or, in other words, for the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, knowing about it would be of great use. Just like now, he had forcefully refined the traces of the power that was related to the true saint by relying on the countless founders of the universe. In the end, through these traces, he had achieved a preliminary level of simulation of the power that was related to the true saint. It was no wonder that the invisible palm was so powerful that Luo Fan had to rely on the power of many levels to deal with it. This is only a semi-finished product. The real finished product should be the incarnation of the will. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, when he looked at the broken rune again, he suddenly discovered that the gap, or rather, the broken part, was clearly just enough to accommodate a certain vortex. All he needed to do was to slightly transform it. With a slight thought, the rune trajectory began to slowly change shape and squirm. Finally, after some subtle angle adjustments, an invisible vortex appeared directly in the rune's orbit. The shape of the vortex was like a huge eye. At this moment, it appeared in the rune's trajectory, causing the rune's trajectory to become extremely strange. It even made people suspect that the eye inside the rune trajectory was emitting some kind of terrifying strangeness. As expected, it seems that I have to destroy this place as soon as possible. At this moment, Luo Fan had already made up his mind. The broken rune trajectory in front of him could already use some of the mysteries of the power related to the true saint. If it was truly completed, it was self-evident how terrifying it would be. Even though Luo Fan was confident in himself, he did not really think that the actions of the incarnation of the will would not affect him at all at that moment. He made a grabbing motion in the air, and countless shadows were released from the perception mirror. These countless shadows were the appearance of perception mirrors one after another. Every shadow had its own dimension. After being released, it began to spread in all directions, directly covering a wider and wider range of space-time. Because of the existence of the mirror shadows, these dimensions suddenly became extremely stable, as if a soft mass of matter suddenly had an additional fulcrum. These dimensions constantly divided the figures of the many world founders, causing them to be unknowingly divided into countless layers of attributes by the countless dimensions, which were then absorbed into the countless dimensions. Those perceptive mirrors were clearly not only there to fix those dimensions. Their existence clearly also took on the role of attack. At this moment, the perception mirror shadows constantly released all kinds of indescribable power, sweeping across the dimension that they existed in. If it was in the complete reality, it would obviously be extremely difficult to erase the figures of the world founders. Although it was not impossible, he could only get rid of a few figures of the world's founders each time. Moreover, the time required for each trip was definitely not short. However, at this moment, through the countless dimensions, the various layers of attributes were extracted from the figures of the complete world founders. The effects of the various layers of attributes complementing each other, supporting each other, and protecting each other naturally disappeared without a trace. Although not all the layers of attributes became extremely weak, because of this, in the countless dimensions, it was impossible for all the layers of attributes to be tough and powerful. Among them, there would definitely be some that were weak and fragile. And these weak and frail ones were obviously where their weaknesses lay. Under the attack of the perception mirror shadows, one could imagine how they performed. In just the blink of an eye, the figures of the world founders within a certain range of Luo Fan's body had already continuously collapsed and died. This kind of collapse and death continued to expand along with the expansion of those dimensions. 1 light year, 2 light years, 3 light years, 10 light years, 100 light years. In just a few dozen breaths, the expansion of the dimension had already reached the point of tens of thousands of light years. All the figures of the world founders within these tens of thousands of light years were constantly destroyed and dying under the attacks of the perception mirror shadows and the various dimensions. It seemed like the expansion of this dimension had an incredible ability. Once swept by these dimensions, all the figures of the world founders would instantly collapse, like a strange body formed by the accumulation of sand. As expected, I've been discovered by you. At this moment, a sigh came from the void. Following that, a vortex began to appear in the void out of nowhere, covering the entire space-time. Under the reflection of this huge vortex, the dimensions that Luo Fan had expanded to encompass tens of thousands of light years seemed so small, like insignificant dots on the vortex. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned. But the current situation was a little terrible. Although it was still the incarnation of the world's will that had appeared in this space-time, this incarnation was much stronger than any incarnation of the world's will that he had seen before. Moreover, it was not just 1 or 2 times stronger, but thousands or even tens of millions of times stronger. At this moment, he directly changed the direction in which the countless dimensions he had released were spreading. They turned in all directions and turned upwards towards the huge vortex. In the blink of an eye, countless shards smashed into the vortex and began to divide it. Unfortunately, this dividing effect caused the vortex to produce circles after circles of ripples, and even made it seem like it was at the critical point of division, as if it would be completely divided in the next moment. All the layers of attributes within seemed to be extracted from the complete vortex, or rather, the complete incarnation of the world's will. However, in the end, this development still came to this. In other words, it stopped at the continuous appearance of the vortex, continuous interweaving, continuous collision, and continuous tearing and crushing each other. In the end, the vortex was not completely divided in the end. This situation was naturally not because the level of the vortex itself had exceeded the scope that Luo Fan could divide. Obviously, this was close to impossible. This was because the source of the power that Luo Fan used to construct the division of the dimensions was not himself. He was merely acting as a channel. It was the many planes that were truly supporting the division of these dimensions. Many layers, apart from the real world. Anything, as long as it did not surpass these many levels, could not resist this kind of division. Even if it could not be done for the time being, it was only because the number of layers participating in the division was not enough. Obviously, although the vortex in front of him was the incarnation of the world's will and was also the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, it was ultimately still limited by the nature of this calamity. It was impossible for it to surpass the layers and ignore the power of the layers. In this case, the division of the dimensions would naturally still be effective against it. In other words, under normal circumstances, the vortex would be divided when it encountered the division of the dimensions. As long as Luo Fan was willing to continue to exert force, he would definitely be able to do it. However, the situation was obviously not like this. No matter how much force Luo Fan exerted, how much he increased the layers he could communicate with, and how hard he tried to combine more layers with these dimensions so that more layers could become the source of the power of the division of the dimensions, he could not further expand the scope of the division of the dimensions. He was also unable to further divide the attributes of the countless layers of the vortex. The reason for this was actually because the volume of the vortex was too huge. All along, Luo Fan had not been too concerned about the volume of things. After all, no matter how big the volume was, as long as the quality did not increase, it was just a bigger pig. As long as the quality was high enough, even if the volume was countless times smaller than the pig, it could definitely be destroyed easily. However, after encountering the world's will this time, he understood that he might have been wrong. After the volume increased to a certain extent, it could actually really ignore the difference in quality. In terms of quality, the division of the dimensions that he was using was definitely much higher than the quality of the world's will. At the very least, at this moment, if the incarnation of the worlds was only at the level that it had appeared in front of him in the past, he would not even need to exert more force and let more layers participate in the division of the dimensions. Just the original division of the dimensions would be enough to completely eliminate the world's will. However, at this moment, no matter how much force he exerted, no matter how much he pushed the division of the dimensions, the incarnation of the worlds will almost completely ignore it. No matter how many layers of attributes the world's will was divided into within the coverage of the dimensions, the surrounding worlds would be able to pour in at the same time and instantly make up for everything that was lost. Once, twice, 100 times, 200 times, 100 million times, 200 million times. No matter how many times it was, no matter how unbelievable the number was, as long as the division appeared, the surrounding compensations and replenishments would appear at the same time, rendering the division of the worlds will useless. If this incarnation of the worlds will could remain motionless and wait for Luo Fan to divide it, perhaps after hundreds of millions of years, or even billions of years, this division could completely divide this incarnation of the world's will. However, for the time being, any division of the worlds would be useless if it was less than this period of time. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly and turn his head to look at the actions of the worlds while outside. At this moment, after the worlds will covered the entire space-time, it began to frantically absorb the endless figures of the world's founders below. At the same time, circles after circles of the world's founders appeared in the void. They were the figures of the world's founders that Luo Fan had destroyed with the division of the dimensions. Evidently, the incarnation of the worlds was not only trying to fuse the surviving world's founders into itself, but it was also trying to fuse even more world's founders into itself. This situation made Luo Fan's eyebrows deeply wrinkle. Looks like it's not going to hold back anymore. From a certain point of view, this is a good thing. He could only say this to himself at this moment. The reason why the worlds did not complete the fusion earlier was clearly because it had its own thoughts. Perhaps it was due to some kind of restriction, or perhaps it would have to pay a price, or perhaps it was because the fusion might not reach a perfect state. No matter what, if the world had its own thoughts, this was clearly not the time for the fusion. However, at this moment, because of Luo Fan's coercion and because of Luo Fan's actions, the worlds finally had no choice but to change its original plan. It had no choice but to start the fusion at a time when it originally thought it was not the right time for the fusion. This situation was clearly a good thing for Luo Fan. However, he still did not know exactly what was good about it. At this moment, the incarnation of the worlds was fusing the figures of the world's founders at a relatively fast speed. While Luo Fan was pondering, the incarnation of the worlds had already fused most of the world's founders into its body. As the figures of the world's founders continued to fuse, the huge vortex also unknowingly underwent some subtle changes. Vaguely, other colors began to appear on the vortex. This color was extremely familiar to Luo Fan. It was the color of the power related to true saints. It was a color that could not be described at all, and it could not be classified by any color at all. Chapter 29:18. At this moment, Luo Fan couldn't be any clearer about what this luster represented when it appeared on the incarnation of the world's will. It really did obtain some characteristics of that power. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind, and his expression became extremely solemn. As those figures continued to merge into the vortex, the luster that belonged to that power above the vortex became richer and more obvious. A subtle aura that belonged to that power gradually emerged from it, a subtle aura that reigned above everything else. This aura could almost suppress everything. Under this aura, the entire space-time seemed to be unable to bear it, and there was a faint feeling of being overwhelmed. Sensing this aura, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. Although it had some characteristics and charm of the power related to the true sage, it was still far from its true essence. In the end, it was still far from its true essence. The gap between it and that power was still as wide as the distance between the heavens and the earth. The reason for such a judgment was actually very simple, and it was because this space-time was overwhelmed at this moment. Don't forget where that power related to the true sage was now. That power was in the core space-time of the world of laws. No matter how confident Luo Fan was and how much he wanted to flatter himself, he didn't dare say that his world of laws was stronger than the great world formed by the incarnation of the worlds that simulated the state of chaos. He also didn't dare say that the core of his world of laws was stronger than the core space-time of the world in front of him. Since the core space-time of the world of laws wasn't stronger than the core space-time of the world in front of him, it was obvious that the power that could overwhelm the core space-time of the world was also not something that the core space-time of the world in front of him could withstand. However, the power that was related to the true sage now existed in the core space-time of the realm of laws effortlessly, and it did not even bring much pressure to the core space-time of the realm of laws. The space-time in front of him, which was clearly stronger than the core space-time of the world of laws, was actually unable to withstand the aura of the power simulated by the will incarnation in the state of chaos. In such a situation, it was obvious that the simulated power wasn't stronger than the real power. Instead, it was because this power had lost a key characteristic of the real power related to the true divine. That was control. This simulated power was obviously unable to achieve perfect control over its own power. If it could control it, the pressure it exerted on the space-time wouldn't be as great as it was now. This kind of flaw seemed to be just a small flaw, but in fact, for Luo Fan, it was equivalent to a huge weakness. With this weakness, it was equivalent to having a breakthrough point. The originally powerful opponent would no longer be helpless. Moreover, this was only from the perspective of this weakness. If one were to analyze it further, the existence of this weakness actually meant that this simulation was actually an extremely crude and simple simulation. Perhaps it could have a little of the characteristics of that power, but it definitely couldn't have too much. After all, if there were really many characteristics, how could such absolute control be missed? It couldn't be completely simulated in the first place, and because of the problem of control, the simulated power couldn't concentrate all its power in the desired location. If there was a way to solve this problem, how could the will of the world not solve it? It was precisely because of these considerations that Luo Fan appeared to be a little relieved at this time. While Luo Fan was working hard to study the incarnation of the will of the world was also taking action. It was constantly absorbing those figures and suppressing Luo Fan. The speed at which it absorbed those figures was obviously faster than the speed at which Luo Fan destroyed the vortex. Therefore, it was obvious that if Luo Fan wanted to rely on this destruction to completely destroy the opponent before it could completely simulate that power, his plan had obviously failed. After understanding this, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The countless dimensions that were constantly expanding toward the vortex suddenly changed direction and expanded upward in all directions. At this time, the most important thing was to stop the vortex. There were obviously two options to stop the vortex. The first option was naturally to attack the vortex directly. The second choice was to attack the target that the vortex wanted to target. Based on the previous situation, it was obvious that Luo Fan's current ability was insufficient to attack the vortex. Therefore, the only choice he could make now was the second option, which was to attack the target of the vortex directly. The vortex wanted to absorb the countless figures and rely on the traces left behind by the power related to the true sage contained in the countless figures to trace back to the source and simulate the power related to the true sage. In this process, the vortex itself had to exist, and those figures were also necessary. Since it was impossible to destroy the vortex, of course, he could only destroy those figures. Directly destroying those figures had also proven to be very difficult due to the various previous developments. Therefore, at this time, when Luo Fan was continuously expanding his dimensional division, the focus of his destruction was actually not on those figures. Although those figures along the way were also divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimension and were easily destroyed by the shadow of the perceptual mirror. During the process of continuous expansion, the real focus of destruction was this space-time. Yes, it was not any other existence, but the space-time itself, which was the core of this world. As the core of this world, This space-time itself was in an extremely delicate position, and the will of heaven and earth clearly did not use this space-time as a carrier for those countless figures. Therefore, although Luo Fan did not know what was so special about this space-time that could help the other party in recreating that power, he clearly knew that the existence of this space-time had an important role in this process. But he clearly knew that the existence of this space-time must have played an important role in this process. In the beginning, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth clearly did not notice Luo Fan's actions. At first, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth obviously did not notice Luo Fan's actions. He just secretly looked at Luo Fan's useless work with disdain, but he sped up the process of evolving more figures of the will of the heavens and earth. He then absorbed and swallowed them, advancing the progress of his simulation of the power related to the true divine. However, as time passed, as Luo Fan's destruction of the space-time became stronger, the space-time itself was continuously divided into many dimensions, and then it was slowly erased and obliterated. The incarnation of the will of heaven and earth finally discovered his actions. In an instant, an indescribable anger erupted from the vortex. Under this eruption, the entire space-time began to tremble rapidly, as if the entire space-time was about to collapse. As for the terrifying aura that leaked from the power that was being simulated, it became extremely violent at this moment, as if it wanted to destroy everything in the space-time, including the space-time itself. It seems that the simulation of power is not completely unaffected by it. Luo Fan did not panic at all, and he only made a calm guess. At this moment, the emotions displayed by the will of heaven and earth were 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before. Under normal circumstances, as the will of heaven and earth, even if it discovered his actions, the vortex should be quite calm at this moment. This was not an issue of the cultivation of the will of heaven and earth, but it was determined by the nature of the will of heaven and earth. Although it was only a simulation of the will of heaven and earth at the 7th major tribulation, there was an essential difference between the level of the true will of heaven and earth. However, after all, it was a simulation of the Great Tribulation. Even if there was a difference in essence, the various performances were definitely very similar. Perhaps some more intense stimuli could make the will of heaven and earth lose its composure, but obviously the destruction that Luo Fan was causing to the core space-time was obviously not that kind of stimulation. Therefore, at this moment, the behavior of the will of heaven and earth was obviously not what it should be doing. Instead, it was the result of being affected by some external force. That external force was obviously the simulation of the power that was constantly advancing in the vortex at this moment. Obviously, the simulation had an extremely profound impact on the will of heaven and earth, causing it to become more emotional. Of course, this was only the effect that was currently being displayed. Luo Fan believed that the simulation would definitely have more and more serious effects on the will of heaven and earth. "Let me see why you care so much about this space-time," said Luo Fan immediately. At this moment, he instantly reduced most of the dimensions, leaving only a small number of dimensions that began to spread in all directions at a speed that was thousands of times faster than before. After all, this space-time was just a space-time, and it was not an existence that was constantly changing. The nature of space-time itself was that it tended to be stable. In this case, as long as a method that could work on a small part of the space-time, it was very likely that it would work on the entire space-time. Previously, during the period before he was discovered by the will of heaven and earth, the destruction that Luo Fan's dimensional division caused to a part of the space-time had clearly allowed Luo Fan to determine the weaknesses of the space-time. He knew which dimensions and which levels could be destroyed as long as they were destroyed. In this way, according to the stable nature of the space-time, these weaknesses were very likely to be the weaknesses of all areas of the space-time. Therefore, as long as he maintained the dimensions that targeted these weaknesses, there was a great possibility that he could directly target the weaknesses of all areas of the space-time. In other words, he was very confident that he could deal with the entire space-time. As most of the dimensions were reduced, the power of the remaining dimensions was greatly enhanced. It was not Luo Fan's own power that determined the power of these dimensions, but the power that was injected into these dimensions by other levels. Luo Fan's role in this was only as a bridge of communication. In other words, Luo Fan had constructed a channel and poured power from other planes through this channel, entering the dimensions that he had separated, assimilating those dimensions into attributes similar to that plane. Then, he had separated the attributes of something that belonged to the plane in the real world. In this case, it was obvious that if the number of the divided dimensions was reduced, Luo Fan would be able to concentrate more power on the specific channel. In this way, the specific channel would naturally increase in size, and the power that could pass through the channel would naturally increase. Therefore, the final result was that if the number of dimensions was reduced, the power of the remaining dimensions would increase. Originally, the dimensions were targeted at the weaknesses, and now that their power had increased, the speed at which they destroyed the space-time naturally began to increase by thousands of times. In just a flash, the space-time that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years completely collapsed due to Luo Fan's destruction. As the scope of the collapse expanded to this extent, an effect finally appeared. The appearance of this effect also made Luo Fan finally understand why the will of the world needed to carry out such a simulation in this space-time. At this moment, as the space-time that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years was destroyed, waves of unimaginably terrifying power flowed through these damaged space-time and towards the main body of that world. In the blink of an eye, the space-time hole that was originally only a few hundred million light-years had expanded by more than 10 times, becoming a few billion light-years in size. Furthermore, it was still expanding at this point. The broken fragments of space-time started to pour out of the hole without any reservation. Countless fragments smashed into the world outside, causing the world outside to emit terrifying sounds of being overwhelmed. It was as if the entire world was gradually being torn apart at this moment. So that's the reason. It seems that I didn't win this time, and he didn't succeed either. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Chapter 29:19. As his many dimensions were annihilated, Luo Fan felt that his clone had instantly fallen into a haze. All of a sudden, he felt as if he had been thrown into a state of chaos from heaven and earth. This haze was extremely mysterious, compared to the state where he could not feel anything when he was in the simulated state of chaos without the protection of the world. He felt like he was in a completely different extreme now. It seemed like he could feel everything here. Time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, paths, heavenly laws, wills, all living beings, everything appeared in his senses at this moment. Moreover, this wasn't an orderly presentation. Instead, it was all in one go. Everything was poured into his heart without reservation, into his senses. It made him feel like everything in him was about to explode at this moment. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan already had a guess in his heart. At this moment, he had probably already fallen between that great world and the simulated state of chaos. The essence of this great world was actually the tribulation level of the simulated state of chaos. This was because it could almost envelop all the worlds in the simulated state of chaos, including all the creators and even the tribulation level of the simulated state of chaos. That was why this world could reach such a level after it was born, and also why it could withstand the presence of the will embodiment in the simulated state of chaos. The relationship between such a world and the simulated state of chaos was definitely an extremely complicated one. In the eyes of ordinary creators, the two might be the simulated state of chaos that was below the tribulation level, or in other words, below this world. But in fact, the two had an almost overlapping relationship. In other words, the simulated state of chaos and this world could actually be considered as 1 and 2, 2 and 1. Being in this world was actually equivalent to being in the simulated state of chaos. Being in the simulated state of chaos was also equivalent to being in this world. From the perspective of dimensions, the two of them were actually equivalent to being in two different dimensions. It was also because of the relationship between the simulated state of chaos and this world that this world could easily absorb the countless worlds in the simulated state of chaos into this world, and could also easily transfer the countless creators of the worlds into this world. After all, because of the overlapping relationship, one only needed to break the indescribable barrier between the two worlds in order to pull those worlds and creators in. The will embodiment was the will embodiment of the simulated state of chaos, and it was also the world's will of this world. Compared to it, whether it was the simulated state of chaos or this world, they were actually just equivalent to its body. If the two bodies in his control wanted to truly come into contact, he only needed to overcome the psychological barrier, which was an extremely simple matter. After understanding the subtle relationship between the two, there was naturally no need to explain where Luo Fan was. At this moment, he had clearly been forcefully pushed out of the core spacetime by the supreme power that had rushed in from outside the core spacetime, as well as out of that world. However, due to the subtle relationship between that world and the simulated state of chaos, he had yet to truly enter the simulated state of chaos. He was only in a state where he was about to enter. In other words, at this moment, he could actually be considered to be in this world, but also in the simulated state of chaos. Of course, on the other hand, it was completely reasonable to say that he was neither in this world nor in the simulated state of chaos. It was precisely because of this strange state that he was able to sense the state of simulated chaos that was difficult to observe, sense, and clearly perceive. At the same time, he was able to sense everything in this world clearly and understand it in his heart. The two intertwined and created the strange feeling he had at this moment. In this state between the world and the simulated state of chaos, Luo Fan felt that his control over his body had been greatly weakened. This weakening ability had almost reached a point where he could not control himself at all. Fortunately, although his control over his body had been weakened, his perception of the other planes still existed. In the simulated state of chaos, the other planes were also completely mixed together. In other words, in the simulated state of chaos, the boundaries between planes had been completely broken. In that world, the boundaries between planes were extremely clear. Therefore, at this moment, when he sensed the other planes, Luo Fan already knew how he could escape from this predicament. He only needed to head towards the area where the boundaries between planes were extremely clear, and he would be able to escape from this predicament and directly enter that world. Of course, if he wanted to enter the simulated state of chaos, he would naturally need to head toward the area where the boundaries between planes had been completely mixed up. Evidently, for Luo Fan, he was currently not interested in entering the simulated state of chaos. Ever since that great world had been opened, and the will incarnation of the simulated state of chaos had entered it, becoming the world's will, the core position of the simulated state of chaos had already been lost. Now, for Luo Fan's seventh great tribulation, the true core had clearly become this great world. At this moment, the simulated state of chaos had instead become the background that supported the existence of this great world, the background that supported the existence of this great tribulation. Faced with this situation, there was no need to say which direction Luo Fan should head in. If it were in the past, it would have been difficult for Luo Fan to head in the direction of order amidst this chaos, even if he had the light of the world. But now, to him, this was only a small matter. The greatest difference was that in the past, Luo Fan could not borrow too much power from other planes in the real world. But now, he could easily borrow the power of hundreds of millions of other levels. Under such circumstances, it was clear that his methods were many times more brilliant than before. Just like at this moment, his perception moved slightly, and the perception mirror appeared above his head. With a slight flash, countless phantoms rushed out from it and directly enveloped Luo Fan. These phantoms were pieces of time and space, or rather, they were dimensions. At this time, these dimensions were like the creation of the world. In this chaotic area, Luo Fan directly opened up a space-time that was enough to accommodate him to do whatever he wanted. Endless power belonging to other planes was continuously injected into these dimensions, continuously separating Luo Fan's various plane attributes. This was also the result of having no other choice. This kind of separation actually did not benefit Luo Fan. This was equivalent to directly exposing the weaknesses that were originally hidden in the layers of defense. Even if Luo Fan could rely on the communication between the various planes to achieve infinite rebirth as long as one plane of himself still existed, this method was still a suicidal action. However, it was obvious that even though Luo Fan could borrow the power of other planes, he could only borrow it. He couldn't perfectly control the power of those planes. What he meant was that although he could construct these dimensions and use the power that belonged to other planes to forcibly maintain these dimensions and spread the chaos that simulated the state of chaos and intertwined with the world, he was still able to create these dimensions. However, it was impossible for him to get rid of the effects of these powers like how he dealt with other powers. In other words, these powers would still accompany these dimensions and be used on him. The result of this effect was what it was now. The various attributes that Luo Fan possessed in the real world were forcibly separated into the various dimensions. At this moment, if there were other powerhouses who could grasp dimensional division here, Luo Fan wouldn't be completely defenseless against them. However, it would also be a lot more dangerous. After all, it was equivalent to directly using one's own weakness to compete with the other party's weakness. It would naturally be fine if he won, but if he lost, it would be a complete failure. However, this obviously wouldn't happen at this moment. Even the worlds will obviously didn't grasp this method of dimensional division. In other words, it couldn't grasp this method of using the power of the planes to divide the dimensions. At this moment, if the worlds will directly appeared here to attack him, Luo Fan would almost definitely be the winner. After all, no matter what, Luo Fan was the one who used this method of dimensional division. Although he had many attributes in those dimensions, as the leader, he still had some privileges. These privileges weren't enough for him to crush his invading opponent easily, but they were enough for him to gain a certain advantage in battle. This advantage wasn't too strong for those who mastered dimensional division and could also borrow the power of other planes, but it was enough for the world's will. At this moment, the void around Luo Fan's body expanded infinitely. From the outside, it looked like a gap of 30 feet had opened up around Luo Fan's body. Outside of this gap was an endless amount of gray and hazy existences. Inside, there were countless overlapping shadows, forming a space-time that seemed extremely spacious, but actually had an extremely complicated structure. As this space-time was opened up, Luo Fan instantly came into contact with that side of the world. As mentioned before, the structure between this side of the world and the simulated chaotic state was very subtle and mysterious. In this case, the distance between space-time was naturally completely meaningless to the gap between this side of the world and the chaotic state. At this moment, after Luo Fan opened up his defenses and avoided the erosion of the gap, he naturally overlapped with that side of the world. In this way, if he wanted to enter that side of the world, he only needed to break the barrier between that side of the world and this space-time, or in other words, the countless dimensions. In the past, when that side of the world was still extremely peaceful, this would not be difficult. In fact, as long as Luo Fan willed it, he could easily achieve this. However, the current situation here clearly had nothing to do with peace. At this moment, this area, or rather, the area that Luo Fan came into contact with by relying on dimensional division, was in a state that was not much better than the simulated chaotic state. In it, the gray existence was constantly surging like a dense fog, and incredible power was constantly attacking and stirring within it. The gray existence, which was like a dense fog, was eroding, killing, and supporting each other. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan instantly understood what was going on. The power that was constantly surging was the incarnation of the world's will. In other words, it was transformed from the incarnation of the world's will, which was a power that simulated the power related to true saints. At this moment, The power was clearly trying its best to rush out of the chaos and regain its freedom. However, it was a pity that the gray existence itself was a product of the simulated chaotic state and that space-time. Although both of them belonged to the will of heaven and earth, or rather, the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, it was as if a machine that belonged to the same person had suddenly gone mad. Even the owner of the machine could no longer control the machine. Instead, he had to be wary of the machine turning against him. At this moment, the incarnation of the simulated chaotic state was like an ordinary person, although that space-time and the simulated chaotic state belonged to him. However, when the two became chaotic and mixed with each other to form an extremely strange state, he had obviously completely lost the ability to control them. Chapter 29:20. After all, this was the will incarnation of the world's will. As the world's will, the incarnation naturally had countless conveniences in this world. If an ordinary creator of the world was faced with such a situation, they would have already been waiting for death. However, for the incarnation of the will that had already become a simulation of that power, although the situation was troublesome, it was not fatal. At this moment, the incarnation of the will began to shrink rapidly in the face of the chaos. Originally, the body of the will incarnation was unbelievably huge, and even billions of light years were insignificant compared to its size. This size had clearly brought it enough convenience in the past, making it impossible for Luo Fan to split it up even if he pushed the dimensional division technique to the limit. However, at this moment, such a huge size had clearly brought him a lot of trouble. The larger the size, the greater the area of contact with the outside world. The outside world was filled with endless chaos, and the entire body was suffering from all sorts of attacks caused by the chaos. Due to this huge size, the number of attacks that the body had to endure also became incomparably huge. Therefore, at this moment, if he wanted to get rid of the influence of the chaos, the first thing he had to do was naturally to shrink his body as much as possible. Once his body shrank, the area of attack would be reduced. The number of attacks would also naturally be reduced. Naturally, it would be much easier to get rid of the attacks. Wanting to shrink his body was naturally an extremely correct idea. However, whether he could do it or not was another matter. In the past, the huge size was the best defensive means of the world's will. However, at a time like this greatest convenience had become the greatest obstacle when he wanted to reduce the size of the building. Billions of light years were only a small dot compared to this huge size, which was enough to show how exaggerated the original size of the incarnation of the will was. With such an exaggerated size, even if it shrank by billions of light years in an instant, it would still take an extremely long time. Obviously, given the speed at which the incarnation was shrinking, how could it shrink by billions of light years in an instant? At this moment, facing such a situation, the will incarnation continued to shrink, and the surrounding chaos continued to destroy it. The huge vortex, or rather, the incomparably large amount of power that simulated that power, was continuously collapsing under this kind of destruction. Although this collapse was only on the surface and was nothing compared to its huge size, it still spread throughout the entire vortex. However, this was the collapse of every inch of the entire vortex. Amidst this destruction, the incarnation of the will became more and more irritated. Although it was painful, difficult, and unpredictable under this attack, it could still withstand it for the time being. On the other hand, the outcome of the space-time that it had high hopes for was not so good. At this moment, the vast and boundless space-time had completely collapsed. Even the endless figures of the creator of the universe, or rather, the traces left behind by the creator of the universe, which belonged to the power related to the true divine, also completely collapsed along with the collapse of the universe. At this moment, it had completely turned into the extremely chaotic state where the universe and the simulated chaos intersected. Although those traces could be refined and fused by the will of the heavens and earth, allowing it to wield unimaginable power, it might even be able to turn the tables and get rid of Luo Fan. However, All of this was the result of the will of heaven and earth tracing back those traces. However, this did not mean that the marks themselves contained such power. Therefore, even though they would possess unimaginable power after being fused together, these traces were ultimately unable to resist the chaotic process of being assimilated into the end. All the traces were completely gone. Without any echo, they had already disappeared into the endless chaos. Not even the slightest trace could be found. In fact, compared to the pain and destruction suffered by the incarnation of the will, the disappearance of these traces made the will of the heavens and earth feel even more pain, anger, and frustration. Although pain and destruction were unbearable for the will of the heavens and earth, they were just some negative feelings. Ordinary cultivators could suppress these negative feelings, let alone the incarnation of the will that was close to the will of the heavens and earth. On the contrary, the result that it had planned for countless years and put in so much effort was finally destroyed and turned into bubbles. This was the greatest blow to its spirit. This was also the most painful thing for it. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan, who was watching from the sidelines, gradually showed a smile on his face. Although he did not know how much power the incarnation of the will could retain and how much power it could retain in the end, it was at least many times better than the previous worst-case scenario. Luo Fan, who had easily gotten rid of the other party, had the right to be happy. In this chaos, even time had become extremely chaotic. Luo Fan, who had been divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimensional division, could actually be considered to be separated from the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, the flow of time in his own body was naturally equal to that of his main body. Meanwhile, his main body was currently in the power related to the true divine, and the flow of time in his body was just the same as the flow of time in the great heavens and earth. Therefore, at this moment, the flow of time in Luo Fan's incarnation was equal to the flow of time in the great heavens and earth in the outside world. In his senses, only a few breaths had passed. In that chaos, tens of millions of years had already passed. After such a long time, the incarnation of the will had finally shrunk its body to a size that could barely be seen. Its surface area was roughly a few 100 million light years in radius. This was still extremely vast, and to any ordinary person, it was a vast area that they might not be able to find its edge in 10 lifetimes. However, compared to its original size, it had shrunk by hundreds of millions of times. Moreover, to Luo Fan, such a size was clearly within the scope of the size that he could deal with. At this moment, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and his heart was already itching to see if there was a chance to teach the incarnation of the will a lesson. To him, the obstacle that prevented him from dealing with the incarnation of the will and getting rid of it was the size of the incarnation of the will. At this moment, the incarnation of the will had become much stronger due to the compression of its body. However, in the end, the biggest obstacle had been destroyed. In this way, he naturally had the possibility of getting rid of it. At this moment, the color of the power related to the true divine above the vortex had become much fainter. Of course, although the color of the power had become much fainter, the overall color was many times richer. However, the richer color was no longer the color of the power related to the true divine. Instead, it was another color that was equally mysterious, profound, and unbelievable. Clearly, the shrinking of the body did not conform to the mystery of the power related to the true divine. That power was obviously not something that could be approached by shrinking the body and condensing the power. The shrinking of the body and the condensing of the power were indeed beneficial to the enhancement and sublimation of the power of the incarnation of the will. It did indeed make the incarnation more powerful and higher in quality. However, the enhancement of the power and the increase in quality had obviously deviated from the power related to the true divine. Of course, this did not mean that the enhancement and the improvement in quality were in the wrong direction. There was no such thing as a right direction or a wrong direction. At least, that was the case in terms of the power. The power related to the true divine was indeed quite powerful, incredible, and almost omnipotent. However, it did not mean that the power was the truth, the way, or the supreme standard. In reality, this power was at most one of the countless types of power that were related to the true divine. In fact, it might not even be the strongest. It only represented an achievement at a certain stage. Perhaps this stage was an extremely high stage for existences like Luo Fan. It was a stage where one could only see their toenails if they looked up. However, this did not mean that this was the only achievement at that stage. It did not mean that the power at that stage was only the power related to the true divine. The will incarnation in front of him had condensed its own body and condensed its own power. Although it deviated from the power that was related to the true divine, its nature was still extremely high. Compared to that power, the power that the incarnation of the will had condensed was mysterious. At this moment, after shrinking to this size, the will incarnation knew that it had already shrunk to its limit. Next, he might be able to improve a little bit and further condense his body size by a tiny bit and a half. However, it was clear that this would waste far too much time. The amount of energy required was simply too much. Perhaps it would take hundreds of millions of years before it could condense a little. This was clearly an unrealistic choice for the current state of the incarnation of the will. The losses it had suffered from resisting the chaos in the outside world for hundreds of millions of years were many times greater than the benefits it could obtain by condensing a little. Faced with such a situation, there was no need to explain what choice the incarnation of the will would make. At this moment, he released boundless power and directly constructed a space-time around him. It was tightly attached to the surface of the huge vortex. It looked like the vortex was covered with a thin film. After the space-time was formed, it began to receive the impact of the chaos in the outside world on the vortex. Endless impacts poured into the space-time, colliding, twisting, strangling, and destroying it continuously. Although the space-time was constructed with the full power of the will avatar and was even tougher and harder to break than this great world, the space-time couldn't even hold on for a short while under the impact of the chaos. Under the impact, countless cracks appeared at the first moment, and on the second moment, countless fragments began to fall from it, constantly being crushed and integrated into the chaos in the surroundings. It was as if what Luo Fan saw was something that happened not long ago. But to the incarnation of the will, it was already tens of millions of years ago. For the incarnation of the will, this situation was already within his expectations. From the very beginning, he had never thought of using this space-time to completely block the chaos in the surroundings. He had constructed this space-time to block the chaos in the outside world for a little while. As long as he had that little bit of time, he would be able to use all sorts of means to escape from this predicament. Fortunately, his essence had improved a lot, which was why he could construct such a sturdy space-time. If it wasn't for the sturdy space-time, he probably wouldn't have been able to see the process of the space-time cracking and shattering. The space-time would have been completely obliterated, devoured, and disappeared the moment it appeared. He wouldn't even be able to discover the process of its destruction. At this moment, the incarnation of the will made a prompt decision. Without any hesitation, he had already begun to rely on the obstruction of the space-time to cross over to the outside world. There was an extremely subtle relationship between space-time and the world. There were countless space-times in the world. In any space-time, there were either fixed or irregular entrances and exits. This was the fundamental reason why space-time seemed to have a location. However, this didn't mean that space-time could only be entered and exited. In fact, the entry and exit points of space-time were just relatively weaker, easier to break through, and easier to enter. It didn't mean that the relationship between the world and space-time was the same as the relationship between the world and the territory. Chapter 29-21. It could be said that even the smallest space-time in the world could connect to any location in the world. At the very least, it could connect to a location without any protection. In other words, theoretically speaking, as long as a space-time was opened up, even the smallest space-time could be used to travel to any location in the world it was attached to. It was the same even if it was billions of light years away from the original space-time. However, it was obvious that this was only in theory. What was possible in theory might not be possible in the real world. It was just like how, in theory, anyone could hit the jackpot, but in reality, most people might not even hit the jackpot once in their lives. It was the same for the communication between space-time and the world. In theory, even the smallest space-time could be used to travel to any location in the world. However, theory was only theory after all. The truth was that this kind of communication required a great deal of energy. Moreover, the further the distance, the more energy was consumed. In fact, this kind of consumption was not linear, but a consumption of several times. For example, a location that was billions of light years away could be reached through the smallest spacetime. However, in order to do this and travel such a long distance with the help of a small spacetime, the energy needed could even make a creator weak for a long time. Normally speaking, in normal spacetime, a creator of the universe would only need a few steps to cross a distance of 100 trillion light years, and the amount of energy consumed would not even be able to keep up with the recovery speed of the creator. Therefore, even if it was feasible in theory, this kind of method was not practical at all. Normally, ordinary cultivators and creators would not choose this method to travel. After all, it was too uneconomical, not practical, and a waste of energy. Moreover, this was only the consumption of distance. If more factors were added, the consumption of energy would be even greater. For example, if there was a natural moat between the location where one wanted to go and where one was, the consumption of energy would be greatly increased due to the barrier of the moat. In this way, with all kinds of restrictions, it was obviously even more inappropriate to use this method to travel. At this moment, the world was using such an inappropriate choice. At this moment, it was forcefully using this space-time to communicate with the location of the normal world outside, which was separated by the boundless chaos. Just the vastness of the chaos itself was shocking. Even if one were to rely on this space-time to cross this distance, the amount of energy required was tens of millions of times more than the usual method of traveling. Moreover, this chaos itself was the best method to cut off space-time. It could be said that it was the most difficult moat to cross in the world. If he wanted to make use of the connection between space-time and the world to bypass this natural moat, he would need to expend tens of thousands of times more energy than he needed to traverse the distance. If the worlds really chose this method, the consumption of energy would even be enough to destroy and recreate tens of thousands of worlds under normal circumstances. Even for the world's will, this consumption was definitely not the kind of consumption that could be laughed off. However, at this moment, facing this consumption, the world made a decision without any hesitation. It activated this mechanism without any hesitation. Endless energy burst out from within and frantically buffed the space-time. It tried its best to strengthen the connection between this space-time and this great world, which was so weak that it was almost completely gone, so that it could try its best to sense the normal world and space-time outside of the chaos. In this process, the consumption of energy was simply like the sky shattering and the heavenly river pouring down, which made even Luo Fan feel a little fearful. This was because even he couldn't bear such consumption, as expected of the incarnation of the will that imitates the state of chaos. Its foundation is really strong. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his heart. Even he would have to peel off a layer of his skin from this consumption. However, for the world's will, it actually didn't show any special reaction after such consumption. It was as if it was as easy as lifting its hand to grab something. The space-time started to shatter under the impact of the chaos. It was extremely fast, and the entire space-time was about to collapse. At this moment, the worlds finally finish strengthening the connection. Without any hesitation, it poured endless energy into it. Through the connection, its figure directly crossed the endless distance and obstacles and directly disappeared from the space-time. When it reappeared, it was already outside the chaos and directly appeared in the normal world. After he disappeared, This expanse of space finally couldn't endure the pressure from the chaos, and it collapsed under the pressure. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into powder and was devoured by the chaos, vanishing without a trace. At the same time, Luo Fan also disappeared from the chaos. After he reappeared, he directly appeared next to the world's will. Of course, this was from his perspective. From the perspective of the world's will, he was currently separated by an unknown number of dimensions and couldn't be seen or sensed at all. The method that Luo Fan used to escape the chaos was completely different from the world's will. He didn't consume any of his energy. In fact, he didn't even consume much of the energy that he originally needed to use the separation of dimensions to isolate the chaos. The reason for this was because he'd connected himself with the will of the world, and he'd borrowed the pull of the will of the world when it left that expanse of space, or rather, when it left that chaotic area, and at the same time, he'd been pulled out of that chaotic area. In other words, the world's will was the one that truly exerted force in the process. He was just riding on it. It's you. All of a sudden, the world's will roared. Then, endless energy was released from its body, engulfing the surrounding space-time and dimensions as it charged towards Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The many dimensions had already completely separated the energy and turned it into countless layers of attributes. As it was separated, the perception mirror appeared out of nowhere in the countless dimensions. In a flash, it had already completely erased the countless layers of attributes that were attacking him from the dimensions. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face in the face of this situation. With a flash of his separation of dimensions, he had already been released. His various layers of attributes instantly reassembled into his body in the real world. His body and mind also appeared out of nowhere in front of the world's will. After the world's will broke free from the chaos, it could already reestablish contact with its main body. Logically speaking, at this time, he should have completely lost the weakness and exhaustion caused by the consumption of energy. After all, even if the world's will clone was huge, it was still insignificant compared to its main body. With this kind of consumption, even if it was completely exhausted, even if the entire incarnation completely collapsed and bet everything on it, this kind of consumption was insignificant compared to the true body. As long as its main body was willing, it only needed to leak out a little of the endless energy it possessed to make up for the clone's loss. Even though that was the case, the world's will clone still felt inexplicably exhausted. It didn't seem to be condensed at all. Instead, it seemed a little empty and powerless. One must know that the world's will clone had already condensed tens of thousands of times. At this moment, although its body was extremely huge, it had already shrunk by tens of thousands of times compared to its original size. In this way, the nature of its energy and its own characteristics should be tens of thousands of times stronger than before. However, although it was still much stronger than before, it was far from the state it was in when it had just condensed. With a single glance, one could tell that he had yet to recover from the exhaustion he had expended earlier. At this moment, he was still in a state of extreme emptiness, extreme fatigue, and extreme exhaustion. This made Luo Fan ponder a lot for a moment, and he vaguely made some guesses. Of course, he still had to test out this conjecture before he could confirm it. At this moment, with a thought, the dimensional division instantly expanded upwards. In the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to the extent that it had completely enveloped the world's will clone. Although the world's will was still extremely huge after being condensed, it had already shrunk to the extent that Luo Fan could deal with it. In this way, his dimensional division had finally completely enveloped the world's will clone. The dimensions kept rushing towards the will incarnation of the world's will, smashing into its body and causing wave after wave of ripples to appear on its body. Facing the ripples, the world's will started to struggle with all its might. Furious roars came from its body. That kind of performance was not much different from a normal living being. It had completely lost the performance that an ordinary world's will should have. Although the world's will had become many times stronger, and there was even a faint aura of power on its body that had a different flavor compared to that power. The worlds will had consumed too much energy. However, at this moment, the consumption was too great, and it was difficult for him to unleash the power of his essence. Under the impact of the countless dimensions, he was slowly being separated by the dimensional segmentation. Gradually, he was divided into layers of attributes and fused with the various dimensions. Even so, the world's will's original body still did not do anything, and the clone still did not ask for help from the world's will. This situation made Luo Fan understand that his previous guess was probably correct. It actually managed to sever the connection with its true body. Is it because of that power? At this moment, he muttered to himself with an indescribable excitement. For the world's will, the most difficult thing to deal with was its size. More specifically, it was the size of its true body. The size of the world will was so large that it had evolved from a quantitative change to a qualitative change. Just by relying on its size, Luo Fan was already at his wit's end. He simply had no way to deal with it. Previously, the reason why he could not deal with the clone of the world's will was because the clone size was too big, and it was difficult to deal with it. But now, the size of the avatar had already been compressed by itself, and the connection between it and the original body had already been severed. In this way, the biggest problem for Luo Fan had already been solved. In this way, it had become possible for him to deal with the avatar of the will of the heavens and earth, which was originally impossible. How could he not be happy? Perhaps I can obtain another power. Suddenly, another thought appeared in his mind, and he could not help but become even more excited. The world will originally wanted to evolve the power that was related to true saints. However, due to the various damages, although the power that had evolved in the end had a slight hint of the power that was related to true saints, it had completely changed overall. The current power was actually completely different from that power in essence. However, at the same time, although its essence was different, this power was actually equally powerful, and it was also worth looking forward to. If Luo Fan could master this power, then his strength would definitely increase by a large margin. Perhaps through this power that was different in essence, but at the same level, he could also deepen his understanding of the power that was related to his true body. At the very least, he could deepen his understanding of the world's will through this power. Putting everything else aside, the reason why the clone of the world's will would sever its connection with its original body and abandon its greatest support was a question that was worth researching. Chapter 29-22. The countless dimensions gradually separated the many attributes of the incarnation of the will of the world and assimilated them into the many dimensions. As the incarnation of the will of the world, it was an existence that was similar to the power related to the true divine. Although it was different from the power related to the true divine, its essence was equally brilliant and powerful. This kind of division was naturally not a simple matter. Originally, Luo Fan only needed to construct the method to divide the dimensions and finally activate the division. What supported the division was no longer him, but the many layers. Hence, after that, he actually did not need to use much power at all, nor did he need to push the dimensions to divide them. At the very most, he could only work hard to expand the passageway between the dimensions so that the power of that layer could descend into those dimensions. Now, facing the incarnation of the will of the world that had condensed the strange power of the will of the world, Luo Fan could not be as relaxed as before. Although that power could not be compared to the power related to the true divine, it was still of an extremely high level and contained all sorts of unimaginable power. At this moment, even if the attributes that had been divided into countless layers were assimilated into the many dimensions, that power still had some special characteristics. When it was brought into the many dimensions, it still firmly protected the attributes of those layers. Under such circumstances, the incarnation of the will, which was originally purely the attributes of those layers, had already been surrounded by layers of illusory figures that wrapped around those attributes. These illusory figures were extremely mysterious and wonderful. They seemed to be the attributes of those layers, but they also seemed to have transcended those attributes and were very different from them. The existence of this kind of phantom made it impossible for Luo Fan to deal with it as he did with other targets. After the dimensional division took effect, it would be easy for him to get rid of it. At this moment, the illusory figures of countless perceptive mirrors continuously swayed among the dimensions, and all sorts of attacks aimed at the attributes of the evil layer continuously surged towards the attributes of those layers. However, in the end, most of the attacks in the dimensions turned into bubbles. They did not even have the ability to shake the illusory figures around the attributes of those layers, let alone break through the illusory figures to harm the attributes of those layers. Only in an extremely small number of dimensions could the targeted attacks released by the illusory figures of the perceptive mirrors hurt those illusory figures and cause some damage to them. However, that was all there was to it. Although some damage could be seen, it was only damage. If one wanted to truly break it, break through its defenses, and come into contact with the attributes that were wrapped within the illusory figure, it was impossible to even think about it. This situation made Luo Fan's expression turn grave. At this moment, he could only do his best to strengthen his own perceptual mirror and integrate more layers of mysteries into it. This allowed the power of the many layers to fuse even more closely and become even more exquisite. Through this method, he tried his best to strengthen the effect of the perceptual mirror phantoms in the various dimensions, making the perceptual mirror phantoms more powerful against the target. He tried his best to break through the defense of the phantoms around the phantoms and injure the internal attributes. This was not a simple matter. Even with Luo Fan's comprehension and understanding of those layers, it would not be easy for him to achieve this. At this moment, he fully activated his thoughts, and the connection between his body and the various layers became even stronger. Endless power was continuously absorbed into the perceptive mirrors from other layers, and then transferred into the illusory figures of the many perceptive mirrors through the perceptive mirrors and into the various dimensions. Following this process, one shadow after another gradually appeared on his body. Faintly, it seemed as if even his body was about to be divided into countless dimensions. At this moment, there was a faint rumble of thunder in the void. There seemed to be a line of sight coming from above. This line of sight was filled with powerful oppression. Even Luo Fan could feel an indescribable pressure emerging from his heart when he was stared at by this line of sight. At this moment, he knew that this line of sight definitely existed, and it definitely seemed to come from the main body of the world's will. Sensing this line of sight, his expression relaxed slightly. This kind of situation had once again proved his previous guess. The connection between the incarnation of the world's will and the main body had been completely severed. Now, even if the main body had already discovered the changes here and discovered that the incarnation was being attacked by him, it could not come to support him at this moment. At the very least, it could not directly send support to the incarnation. This situation was obviously a good thing for him. At the very least, the target he needed to face now was the rather difficult incarnation of the world's will, and not the main body of the world's will. At this moment, under Luo Fan's efforts, the attacks released by the illusory figures of the perceptive mirrors in the various dimensions began to undergo various changes. Originally, it was just a simple charge and suppression, but it gradually turned into all kinds of strange attacks. Some were shining, some were changing rules, some were changing nomological laws, and some were even battle techniques such as blade techniques and sword techniques. In some dimensions, those attacks even turned into various magic treasures with different functions. All kinds of strange attacks condensed almost all the attack methods that Luo Fan knew. He used all kinds of strange angles to probe the illusory figures in the various dimensions, trying to break through the illusory figures' defenses and destroy the internal attributes of the illusory figures. Although the effects were not obvious for the time being, it was clear that the incarnation of the world's will was rather helpless against his methods. Although the illusory figures could still firmly protect many of the internal attributes in the various dimensions for the time being, even the illusory figures who performed poorly were only shaken, and the internal attributes were not really damaged. However, this was obviously only temporary. Even if it was a fight between two ordinary people, a powerhouse who was slow to react would definitely lose to the more agile person's attack, let alone an existence at Luo Fan's level. To Luo Fan, his opponent's slow reaction and powerlessness were like a dead object waiting for him to study, think of, or even create a way to attack his opponent. If he still could not defeat his opponent in this way, he would not have cultivated to this level. At this moment, faced with such an incarnation of the world's will, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He continuously probed the illusory figure's properties in the various dimensions. The results of these tests were continuously transmitted to his heart, and he gradually integrated them. In just a short span of a few dozen breaths, the properties of the illusory figure had already formed a complete table in his mind. Although the table was extremely vast and long, it was extremely shocking. If it was an ordinary person, they would probably need to spend thousands or even tens of thousands of years just to finish looking through it. However, since all the properties have been listed in a table, the illusory figure naturally no longer had any secrets to Luo Fan. Since there were no more secrets, his weakness was naturally exposed. Immediately, as thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, endless information flashed through his mind. In the end, he had already come up with several dozen ways to deal with the illusory figure in the various dimensions. Among those methods, he could find as many as 3 methods that were convenient to use and had the strongest effects. Let's see what other trump cards you have. At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he felt an urge to give it a try. With this urge, he began to take action. He chose the first method, which was also the simplest method to execute. At this moment, indescribable rays of light erupted from the many dimensions and from the illusory figure in his perception mirror. After these rays of light erupted, they began to evolve naturally and eventually turned into human figures. Each of them looked exactly like Luo Fan, but their insides seemed to be filled with infinite laws and principles, infinite concepts, and even a worldview of the laws. After these figures appeared, it was as if the core of the dimension had descended out of thin air. There was a charm of suppressing the heavens and completely controlling the universe. Immediately after, these figures brazenly rushed towards the various layers of attributes of the will incarnation of the world's will. At this moment, the illusory figures in the various dimensions reacted at the same time. Of course, the reactions of the many illusory figures were naturally different due to the different environments. Some of the phantoms directly pounced towards the phantoms that had a similar appearance to Luo Fan, wanting to directly shatter it with their powerful strength. Some of them transformed into another form and derived the void, wanting to protect themselves and isolate the phantoms that had a similar appearance to Luo Fan. Some transformed into existences like weapons that drowned out Luo Fan's figure. There were all kinds of them, and they seemed to have exhausted all forms of attacks that could exist in the universe. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan's figure also appeared extremely calm. Before the attack arrived, he easily performed all kinds of methods and forcibly wiped out the numerous attacks. His figure brazenly crashed into the illusory figure, blocking the illusory figure while continuously approaching the core of the illusory figure. Those illusory figures were protecting the level attributes of the will incarnation of the world's will. Or rather, it was the level attributes that belonged to that power. At this moment, the figures of Luo Fan that appeared in those dimensions were existences derived from Luo Fan's worldview, which is a combination of many concepts and the power of the dimensions. This existence seemed like a human figure, but it was actually a world of laws that had been materialized according to the level. Or rather, it was just like the level attributes of the world of laws, although it had already been condensed and was very different from the original level attributes of the world of laws. It still contained some characteristics of the world of laws. At this moment, the countless illusory figures drowned out the figure. In fact, it was equivalent to those illusory figures attacking the world of laws. A world of laws naturally couldn't be annihilated so easily. Even at this moment, the level displayed by those illusory figures was extremely high, and the power they displayed was extremely terrifying. Even in those many dimensions, they could still ignore the nature of the dimension itself and exert some of the power of the complete power. However, they were still existences in different dimensions and hadn't undergone dimensional materialization. It could be said that they were still somewhat unacclimatized to the various dimensions. This sort of unacclimatization naturally wasn't a big deal in the past. After all, even the attacks of the perceptual mirrors of Luo Fan didn't belong to those levels, or rather, those dimensional techniques. In a way, the degree of materialization was also insufficient. However, things were different now for the Luo Fan. The Luo Fan in those dimensions was completely a world of laws that had been materialized according to those dimensions. Although it was only a temporary existence that couldn't last long, and it was impossible for it to truly continue to evolve, the world of laws was still a world of laws. However, the world of laws was the world of laws. Its might, power, worldview, and uniqueness were all unquestionable. The world of laws that had been materialized according to those dimensions was like a fish in water, and it could receive the endless blessings of those dimensions. In this way, if they wanted to destroy the Luo Fan, they would have to break those dimensions first. Otherwise, no matter how many of these Luo Fans were destroyed and how serious their injuries were, they could easily recover through the replenishment of those dimensions. Under such circumstances, how could those illusory figures easily annihilate the Luo Fan? In the end, when the Luo Fan passed through the protection of those illusory figures and appeared in front of those dimensions, the illusory figures only managed to annihilate more than half of the Luo Fan's bodies. Moreover, not all the illusory figures in the dimensions could do this. In the vast majority of the dimensions, the illusory figures could only leave some traces on the bodies of the Luo Fan. I finally succeeded. At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Chapter 29-23. These Luo Fans' bodies were formed from the laws of the dimension. Not only were their bodies incomparably tough, but they could also create and give birth to all the power they wanted at any time and recover all the damage they suffered. They could also make use of the resonance between themselves and the dimension and the corresponding plane to absorb everything they needed from the dimension and other planes. Under such circumstances, as long as it wasn't destroyed and erased at the first moment, it was almost certain that it would recover. Therefore, at this time, although most of the figures had already suffered serious injuries when they passed through the phantoms, all their injuries quickly recovered with the help of various factors. Faced with such a situation, the plane attributes of the world's will in the dimensions began to panic. Without the protection of the phantoms, the plane attributes had already lost their final trump card. They were no longer concealed and directly appeared in front of the Luo Fan's figures in the dimensions. At such a time, Luo Fan didn't have the mood to talk nonsense at all. With just a thought, the figures in the dimensions began to take action. One by one, they began to attack the plane attributes of the world's will incarnations in the dimensions. In most of the dimensions, the Luo Fans could only injure the plane attributes and couldn't get rid of them in a short period of time. However, in a few dimensions, the plane attributes couldn't resist at all and were easily dealt with by the Luo Fans figures in the dimensions. The reason for this was naturally because the plane attributes were the plane attributes of the world's will incarnations. Just what kind of unfathomable existence was this great world's world will? This was something that had been said many, many times before. Such a world's will couldn't be ordinary even if it was only the plane attributes. At the very least, it was impossible for all the plane attributes to be ordinary. The vast majority of the plane attributes were far superior to the plane attributes of ordinary objects. These were the plane attributes that had the ability to resist the Luo Fans figures in the dimensions. Of course, the vast majority was only the vast majority. In the end, it wasn't everything. After all, the world couldn't really extend its means to all planes. so it couldn't be as easy as Luo Fan to control the plane attributes corresponding to itself. Therefore, even though the power it simulated had unimaginable characteristics and could affect many planes in a mysterious way to protect its plane attributes, it couldn't be perfect after all. In the end, it couldn't be perfect and leave no flaws. The plane attributes corresponding to those flaws were obviously the focus of Luo Fan's attack. This was also the plane attributes that Luo Fan could easily destroy in those dimensions. The destruction of a plane attribute did not only affect the corresponding plane. Every plane attribute was closely related to the entire plane. Every plane attribute was closely related to the entire plane. In the real world, the destruction of any layer of attributes would bring about the destruction of the entire entity. This was just like the many vital organs in a living being's body. For living beings, the organs in their bodies were indeed only a part of their bodies and could not be equated with their lives. This was like the many vital organs in a living being's body. To a living being, the organs were only a part of its body and couldn't be equated with its life. For everything in the real world, the attributes of the plane were equivalent to their vital organs. If any one of them was destroyed, it would lead to the complete destruction of the entire plane. Of course, although the vital organs were used as an analogy, the organs and plane attributes of a living being were still fundamentally different. At the very least, although some of the organs of a living being were important, they weren't closely related to its life. For example, the skin and the cecum. However, the plane attributes were different. Every single one of the plane attributes was an indispensable part of things in the real plane. In other words, to anything in the real plane, the plane attributes were its vital organs. From this aspect, if anything were to be looked at from the plane attributes, it would obviously have too many vital organs. This might be a little unreasonable, but it was the truth. In order to directly target the plane attributes, one must have incredible abilities and unimaginable knowledge. To obtain such abilities and knowledge was obviously countless times more difficult than identifying the location of a living being's vital organs and the method to destroy them. It was only natural that he could gain so much from such a difficult task and grasp so many weaknesses. At this moment, the countless plane attributes in front of Luo Fan started to collapse on their own. And at the same time as these plane attributes collapsed, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth that existed in the whole of the real plane also collapsed at this moment. The huge vortex seemed to have lost its ability to restrain itself. Everything that formed the vortex dissipated in all directions and turned into smoke that gradually melted into the surrounding void. It either disappeared without a trace or turned into all sorts of strange or ordinary things in the sea below. In an instant, the sea seemed to have been reopened. All sorts of islands were born, all sorts of living beings were born, and all sorts of strange things were born out of thin air. It seemed very mysterious and strange. In the beginning, Luo Fan was extremely satisfied. He was all smiles as he looked at the changes in the vortex in front of him. However, as time passed, he gradually felt that something was wrong. The speed at which the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth dissipated was simply too fast. At the very least, it was more than 10 times faster than what he had originally expected. The incarnation of the will of heaven and earth dissipated and collapsed because some of its plane attributes were destroyed. With Luo Fan's understanding of planes and his familiarity with the attributes of planes, he was clearly aware of the consequences of the collapse of certain planes' attributes, how fast they would dissipate, and how fast they would collapse. Thus, even if his guess about the speed at which the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth collapsed differed from reality, it would at most be a difference of 1 or 2 times. Any more than that, and it would be a sign that there were changes that he did not understand. And now, the speed at which the incarnation of the will dissipated was more than 10 times faster than what he had expected. This situation did not seem right no matter how he looked at it. No matter how he looked at it, there seemed to be some changes that he did not understand appearing in the will of heaven and earth. After discovering this, Luo Fan did not dare to hesitate. he released the many-dimensional splitting techniques that he had already restrained and strengthened them even further. They began to continuously spread into the interior of the incarnation of the will that was collapsing. At this moment, the dimensional splitting technique was almost unobstructed as it probed into the interior of the incarnation of the will. The incarnation of the will that was collapsing clearly did not have any defensive capabilities, and it was completely helpless against the dimensional splitting technique. The dimensional splitting technique continued to penetrate deeper and deeper, and it continuously approached the core of the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth. Originally, the countless dimensions were enough to completely envelop the incarnation of the will. Previously, when he destroyed the plane attributes of the incarnation of the will, he had clearly done the same. However, at this moment, he vaguely realized that the deeper his dimensional splitting technique went, the weaker it seemed to be at the core. Is it because of the chaos? Such a guess flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, he quickly rejected this possibility. Even if it was chaos, it was not enough to cause such an outcome. After all, although chaos itself had countless possibilities, it could not change the plane. At this moment, the plane attributes of the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth had clearly completely collapsed. Everything that made up the incarnation of the will had clearly lost its complete nature. Under such circumstances, even if it was chaos, it would at most affect a certain level of attributes or a certain dimension. It would never be able to slow down the division of any dimension. There's something inside. After figuring this out, Luo Fan instantly made a judgment in his heart. Since he had already made a judgment, there was no need to say more about what he should do next. Since there was something inside, he naturally had to find it. With a slight thought, he exerted a little more force on the dimensional splitting technique. Many similar but fundamentally different versions of Luo Fan appeared in the various dimensions at the same time. After these Luo Fan appeared, they each released various kinds of power that ordinary cultivators dared not even think about, directly sweeping away the various discrete plane attributes that belonged to the vortex in those dimensions. If the vortex was still intact in the past, these plane attributes would naturally have the overall power to protect it, and it would not be easy to destroy it at all. However, now that it had completely collapsed, the vortex itself could even be considered to have ceased to exist. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no overall power to protect it, and the various plane attributes naturally did not have any protection. There was no need to say what would happen to Luo Fan, who was materialized in different dimensions. If he were to face the Luo Fan, who had appeared in different dimensions, there was no need to say more. In just an instant, the world became clear. The power that was originally constantly collapsing, disintegrating into the void, merging into the ocean, or stirring the laws of the vortex had completely disappeared at this moment, as if it had never appeared. Evidently, due to the destruction of practically all the layers of the vortex, not even a single trace of it remained. Although this vortex was much smaller than the original incarnation of the world's will, its size was still calculated in light years. After completely wiping out this large vortex, the things that remained were extremely inconspicuous in comparison. In this inconspicuous state, even Luo Fan took a while to discover the marvelous object that existed in the center of the vortex after the collapse of the vortex. It was a small vortex. It was only a few hundred feet in radius, and it looked many times more solid than the previous vortex. The power that belonged to the incarnation of the worlds was also many times denser. In fact, it could even be said that apart from the appearance of the vortex, there seemed to be nothing else related to the world's will. At this moment, although Luo Fan did not know what it was, he knew very well that he could not sit back and watch it develop naturally. Immediately, he took action without any hesitation. In a flash, he had already traversed through space and appeared in front of the vortex. Then, he raised his hand and covered the void of the vortex. At the same time, countless dimensions slammed into the vortex. However, Not even the slightest ripple emerged from the numerous dimensions this time. These dimensions were unable to invade the vortex at all. The vortex existed there as if it did not have any plane attributes. It was everything without any concealment, and it could not be divided in any form. Pure and unique. At this moment, these words suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, only these 4 words could describe this vortex. It could even be said that only the current vortex could truly be called these words. Apart from this vortex, any other existence that Luo Fan had used these words to describe in the past was not worthy of these words at all. Faced with the fact that his dimensional division had lost its effect, Luo Fan did not give up. On the one hand, he increased the number of passageways that he could communicate with the various planes, and on the other hand, he began to communicate with his other incarnation. On the other hand, he began to communicate with his other incarnation. It was the incarnation of the 3-legged cauldron that was condensed from the power related to the true sage. Endless suppressive power quickly traversed space and time as he communicated with it. Following his thoughts, it fiercely suppressed the vortex that was dozens of feet in radius in front of him. As the suppressive power descended, everything in the surroundings seemed to have frozen in an instant. Even if it was space-time, the various dimensions, the passageways of the various planes, and the power of the various planes, everything that was going on stopped at this moment. Chapter 29-24. Under this suppressive force, the small vortex that was several meters wide seemed to freeze slightly. However, this stagnation was quickly broken. In the next instant, the vortex suddenly started to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it turned into the appearance of a middle-aged man. He replaced the existence of the vortex and appeared at the center of the suppressive force. This middle-aged man seemed to be in his 40s. He looked calm and composed, as if he was in control of everything in the universe. At this moment, after appearing in front of Luo Fan, he smiled and looked at Luo Fan with eyes that seemed to glow. At this moment, the figures of Luo Fan that existed in the countless dimensions collapsed one by one, as if they were under some kind of indescribable pressure. As the figures of Luo Fan collapsed and disappeared, the dimensions that had been separated also gradually started to shake and distort at the same time. In the next instant, all the dimensions collapsed, and the surroundings returned to normal in the real world, as if nothing had happened. It was just that without the pure vortex, there was this extremely extraordinary-looking middle-aged man in front of him. The suppressive force was still acting on the middle-aged man, but the middle-aged man seemed to completely ignore it. At this moment, even though he was bathed in the suppressive force, his expression did not change at all. He only looked at Luo Fan quietly. "Have you been devoured by the power?" Luo Fan asked. "Devoured? No. It's just that I obtained a power clone like you," the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. "Power clone? This doesn't look like a power clone at all. Power clones should be closely connected to one's main body. Do you still have any connection with your main body?" Luo Fan asked. This middle-aged man had a human form. In other words, he had the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew, and he looked exactly like him. However, this was only the form and the essence of the body. The specific appearance, figure, and many other details were completely different from his. It was clear that the middle-aged man had constructed his body out of thin air using the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew, and not Luo Fan's appearance. There was a prerequisite for constructing a body based on what Luo Fan knew of the born Taoism aptitude. That was, he had to first agree with Luo Fan's understanding of the born Taoism aptitude. In other words, he had to agree with part of Luo Fan's worldview, even if it was only a part of it that was related to the connate Taoism aptitude. If this middle-aged man was the main body of a living creature, it would naturally not be a big deal. Agreeing with a certain concept about the born Taoism aptitude was not actually a distortion of one's self. In other words, if this middle-aged man was in his original form, there would be no possibility of him being devoured by the power. Unfortunately, This middle-aged man was not his real body. He was merely the incarnation of the will of the world. As the embodiment of the will of the world, its relationship with the main body was clearly that of a subsidiary. There was no problem with the main body changing and the incarnation changing. However, if the main body did not change, but the incarnation changed, then there was a problem. This was especially so when it came to the change in the choice of concept. The main body of the middle-aged man, the will of the world, was still in the form of vortex. It still did not acknowledge any form as the born Taoism aptitude, but the incarnation in front of him had acknowledged a certain form as the born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, it was obvious that there was a difference between the main body and the incarnation. This difference could not have appeared without a reason, no matter how he thought about it. It seemed that the power that was simulated was the source of the difference. It was because of this consideration that Luo Fan felt that the incarnation of the will of the world in front of him had actually been devoured by that power. At the very least, it had been distorted by it. Perhaps. The middle-aged man had no intention of explaining to Luo Fan at all. At this moment, his body swayed, and his figure had already appeared in front of Luo Fan. He raised his hand and slapped at Luo Fan. There was no reaction from his surroundings at all. It was as if his action was just the most ordinary and casual action of an ordinary person. However, it was this slap that made Luo Fan feel an incredible pressure. It was as if he was enduring the pressure of the universe at this moment. The palm seemed to have filled the world, permeating all space-time, all dimensions, and all planes. Faced with such an attack, how could Luo Fan dare to be careless? At this moment, a series of concept magic erupted from his body and turned into a world of magic. He threw it out with one hand, and it met the palm of the middle-aged man in front of him. At Luo Fan's level, space-time could almost be played with at will. At this moment, even if the world of magic was boundless, under Luo Fan's will, it was only the size of a fist on the surface. It was not much different from the palm that the middle-aged man in front of him had sent out. When the two collided, an endless shockwave was released from the collision. Along with this shockwave, there were also endless rumbles, endless power, and even endless matter. However, all of this was in an invisible form that was continuously transmitted in all directions along with the shockwave. As for the surrounding space-time and the surrounding laws, they were completely shattered in an instant and turned into nothingness. Moreover, the nothingness and chaos were still spreading wildly as the shock waves continued to spread. In the blink of an eye, a boundless void appeared around them. Outside this void, at the edge, endless things were being formed. Among these things that were being formed, there was energy, matter, space-time, karma, fate, rules, laws, and so on. Everything that could be found in a normal world could be found there. However, most of these things that were being formed were extremely chaotic. Not to mention forming a world, it was extremely difficult to pick out a small part of them. Only a very small number of areas would show order and even the appearance of space-time due to the various complicated changes. However, everything was quickly destroyed by the shock waves. They disappeared and turned into nothingness once again, causing the area of nothingness to expand even further. In the normal space-time outside, countless things were being formed again, and they quickly disappeared. Just like that, the cycle continued and continued to advance in all directions. This process seemed extremely long, but in reality, for Luo Fan and the middle-aged man, it had already been a very long time since they started fighting. In that instant, the speed at which they attacked each other was extremely fast. In just the blink of an eye, they had already exchanged tens of thousands of moves. For Luo Fan, his dimension separation could not split the other party, nor could he turn the other party into countless layers of attributes. His suppressive power could not suppress the other party either. This made it impossible for him to get rid of the other party as easily as he had when he faced the incarnation of the world's will. In this way, he could only choose to use all sorts of abilities, concepts, powers, and powers to fight the other party, just like how he had fought in the past. Fortunately, his dimensional division technique and suppressive force were not completely useless. Although it seemed like he could not directly target the other party and get rid of the other party easily. But in reality, it was precisely because of these two things that the middle-aged man could not unleash his techniques recklessly. He seemed to not care about the dimension separation and the suppressive power at all, as if he had completely disregarded them. However, it was obvious that this was only what it looked like. In reality, during this process, he had to expend a lot of energy and a lot of mental energy to maintain the dimension separation around him and resist the powerful suppressive power at all times. Because of this huge consumption, he could not truly display his advantages and directly get rid of Luo Fan's incarnation. After all, if it was really as he had displayed, completely disregarding the dimension separation and the suppressive power, it was clearly close to the power related to a true saint. With such a special characteristic, how could it be possible for it to be entangled with Luo Fan's incarnation for such a long time? In every breath, they exchanged tens of thousands of moves. All sorts of wonderful divine abilities and techniques that could make ordinary people feel like their worldview had been subverted were being displayed between them at every moment. The commotion that they caused also continued to spread in all directions. The void that had been swept out when the dimension separation and the palm came into contact for the first time was already filled with concentric circles. These concentric circles were naturally the various movements that occurred during the process of their battle. They were either fluctuations, power, light, sound waves, matter, space-time, nomological laws, rules, or even the fluctuations of the great Tao. They could be said to have everything. These concentric circles continued to spread in all directions as they continued to exchange blows, following the fluctuations of the object that had appeared in the beginning and frantically spreading outwards. Very soon, he had already crossed a distance of who knows how many billions of light years, and crashed into the chaos that covered an area of who knows how many billions of light years at the core of the world. The moment the shock wave came into contact with the chaos, boundless chaos suddenly erupted and instantly engulfed the outermost shock wave. In the blink of an eye, it had already followed the trajectory of the shock wave and directly wrapped around the countless concentric circles in the center, like a huge circle. In the center of this concentric circle, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man were also present. At this moment, both Luo Fan and the middle-aged man seemed to have sensed something. To them, the shock wave produced by the collision of their own power was like an extension of their own power. It must be known that they were not ordinary cultivators or even ordinary people. For ordinary cultivators or even ordinary people, the shock wave caused by the collision of their power was the shock wave that had already been released. It had nothing to do with them at all. However, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, no matter how long they had been separated from their own power, they would not sever their connection with it. Unless there was a stronger power or a higher existence that severed this connection, the shock wave produced after their collision was naturally the same. From a certain point of view, these shock waves could even be regarded as another battlefield that they had opened up. It also carried the purpose of their battle, and they were also trying their best to suppress their opponents and get rid of them. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly lose their perception of these shock waves? Therefore, at this moment, the moment these shock waves were engulfed by the chaos, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man instantly sensed it. Looks like we can't continue fighting anymore. At this moment, both Luo Fan and the middle-aged man instantly confirmed this point. The chaos had already formed a circle in all directions, directly surrounding the area where Luo Fan and the middle-aged man were. Although there was still an extremely great distance between them, it was almost inevitable that they would be able to cross this distance. If they did not pay attention to it, very soon, this area that spanned hundreds of millions of light years would also turn into endless chaos, and it would also become like the chaotic state at the core of the world. At that time, if they wanted to break through and escape, it wouldn't be as easy as it was now. With a slight thought, the two of them confirmed each other's thoughts. At this moment, they did not continue fighting, and they did not even have the intention to try their last move. They instantly separated. As they separated, the concentric circles that had been continuously generated around their bodies instantly stopped. The surrounding void became wider and wider. In the blink of an eye, their surroundings had become completely silent. There was no longer any sound or movement. Chapter 29-25. It was obvious that if the two of them did not pay attention to the situation, the chaos would eventually drown them again. It was not a good feeling to be drowned by the chaos. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he wanted to avoid this kind of chaotic damage, he would need to use many methods to do so. It might not be a big deal under normal circumstances, but in a battle, especially when he was facing the middle-aged man, it would be even more dangerous. Because of this, Luo Fan did not want to fall into the chaos again. Although the middle-aged man did not know how strong his resistance against the chaos was, it was obvious that he had not reached a state where he could completely ignore it. Once he fell into the chaos, he might only need to exert a little bit of strength to avoid the erosion and influence of the chaos. Or he might need to expend a lot of strength to resist the erosion and influence of the chaos. Obviously, with Luo Fan watching from the side, the middle-aged man was not willing to fall into such an awkward situation. Luo Fan was extremely wary of the middle-aged man, and the middle-aged man was obviously not indifferent to Luo Fan either, because both of them had the same thought. When they discovered that the chaos was rapidly approaching them, both of them stopped at the same time. In that instant, both of them knew what the other was thinking without looking at each other. Suddenly, the same thought appeared in both of their minds at the same time. Maybe I should choose to make a move now. The middle-aged man's choice showed that the chaos had a considerable impact on him. Perhaps the impact he received was not as serious as the middle-aged man's. If that was the case, making a move would obviously be advantageous to him. Both of them thought so, but in the end, they gave up on this idea. It was just a possibility. Perhaps the impact he received was not as serious as the middle-aged man's, but perhaps it was just the middle-aged man's mistake in judgment. Or perhaps the truth was the other way around. Obviously, the outcome was unpredictable. For such an unpredictable result, Luo Fan was naturally repulsed. As for the middle-aged man, he was also against it. Hence, since they had already stopped, there was naturally no need for them to continue fighting. After all, apart from the chaos, there were simply too many places for them to make a move. The vast and boundless world was a stage for them to take action. Since there were so many places to take action, why did they have to fight to the death in a place where the consequences were unpredictable? However, although the two of them did not continue to fight, it was obvious that they would not start working together. The chaos outside was just a little troublesome for them, but it wasn't enough to make them feel troubled. At this moment, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man disappeared from the center with a flash. When they reappeared, they were at the two ends of the void. When the two of them were connected, it just so happened that the diameter of the void passed through the core. This was obviously the furthest distance they could get from each other. At this moment, after arriving at these two locations, the two of them began to take action. In reality, the two of them seemed to have completely disappeared in an instant. Needless to say, Luo Fan enveloped himself with countless dimensions and divided himself so that he completely disappeared from the main body of reality. On the other hand, the middle-aged man directly constructed a space-time to envelop himself. In the end, he used supreme power to forcibly strengthen the connection between the normal space-time and the space-time he had created. After paying a huge price, he directly penetrated the connection and disappeared from the space-time, as well as the void. At the same time, Luo Fan's figure also directly entered the chaos along with the other multiple dimensions. Although the chaos was extremely powerful, and even the middle-aged man, who was a derivative of the world's will, was unwilling to touch it. However, in reality, at least at this moment, its width was not much at all. As long as one could withstand the corrosion of the chaos, it would not be difficult to cross its width. At least for Luo Fan, it was not a difficult thing to do. Very soon, Luo Fan, who was enveloped and divided by the dimensions, had already withstood the endless chaos and the infinite corrosive and devouring power. He directly rushed out of the chaos and appeared in the normal space-time of the outside world. After arriving here, the dimension separation disappeared instantly. His figure also disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already hundreds of millions of light years away. At the moment when he disappeared, the area where he appeared instantly collapsed, and everything was erased in an instant. Even the void seemed to have ceased to exist. After a while, the middle-aged man appeared outside the area and looked at the place where everything had been erased regretfully. Obviously, the middle-aged man was the one who had attacked just now. Although Luo Fan and the middle-aged man had also escaped from the void and the chaotic wrapping, it was clear that the middle-aged man had consumed more energy in an instant, and his power was greater, but his speed was faster. After all, he had only crossed space-time and had not moved in the normal space at all. Such a process could be completed in an instant as long as a sufficient price was paid. Obviously, the middle-aged man had completed it in an instant. In this way, there was a result. That was when Luo Fan rushed out of the chaos. The middle-aged man had been waiting outside for a long time. Under such circumstances, unless the middle-aged man was a fool, how could he not see if there was a chance to sneak an attack on Luo Fan? Obviously, the middle-aged man was not a fool. However, what was more obvious was that although Luo Fan's speed was slower, he had consumed less power. He did not need to recover at all to take other actions. In this way, when he got out of the chaos, he directly activated his technique and consumed a large amount of power to directly cross space-time and leave his original position. He appeared here hundreds of millions of light years away from the place where trouble had arisen. The middle-aged man's regret was obvious. He had clearly done his best, but he still could not get rid of his opponent. How could he not feel regret? Although it was hundreds of millions of light years away, this distance was not much of an obstacle for existences at Luo Fan's level. At this moment, the middle-aged man had already discovered Luo Fan's position. As for Luo Fan, he also noticed the middle-aged man's previous actions. The two of them were separated by hundreds of millions of light years. When their gazes met, it was as if they were face to face. The distance of 1 year of walking was 1 light year. Normally, it would take hundreds of millions of years for their gazes to meet over a distance of hundreds of millions of light years. However, it was obvious that this was only the situation in the normal space-time and the normal universe. Or rather, it was only the situation in the universe after Earth was broken. In a more advanced world, in a more brilliant universe, the speed of light was not as fixed as that of the broken Earth, or as slow as that of the universe after the Earth. Just the huge difference in the speed of light was enough to make the distance of hundreds of millions of light years no longer an obstacle to one's line of sight. Furthermore, the ones looking at them were Luo Fan, an existence who was going through the seventh tribulation, and the middle-aged man, who was a derivative of the will of the world. Given their level, how could the things they wanted to see be limited by distance? With all these conveniences, even hundreds of millions of light years would not be an obstacle to them looking at each other. At this moment, the middle-aged man did not continue to attack Luo Fan. After looking at Luo Fan for a while, he turned around and left. His figure instantly disappeared from Luo Fan's senses, as if he had never appeared. There seemed to be a subtle vibration in the sky, as if some sort of change had occurred in the sky. It seems like his greatest enemy is not me. At this moment, Luo Fan realized something. The middle-aged man's strength was actually much stronger than his current incarnation. If his incarnation had not had the powerful support of his main body in another incarnation, he would have been completely eliminated when he had started fighting with the middle-aged man. Under such circumstances, it was absolutely difficult for him to detect the middle-aged man within a short period of time if the middle-aged man wanted to hide. Therefore, he had completely lost track of the middle-aged man. If the middle-aged man had simply wanted to guard against him, there was no need for him to do this. Although the battle between Luo Fan and the middle-aged man seemed to be exchanging blows, the truth was that the middle-aged man had the upper hand. All along, only those who were at a disadvantage would flee in panic. Those who did not have the upper hand would instead avoid their enemies as if they were avoiding the plague. Therefore, It was obvious that the middle-aged man had displayed his concealment ability to such an extent. It was obvious that his real target was not Luo Fan. Since his target was not Luo Fan, there was no need to say what he was after. The changes in the sky became more and more obvious, and there were even faint muffled sounds that lingered. The laws of this world, at least within a range of billions of light years, were undergoing all sorts of indescribable changes. It was as if some sort of indescribable probing law was being formed. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was even more convinced of his guess. As expected, it's the matter between the main body and the incarnation. At that moment, he could only sigh to himself. At this moment, he could not be bothered to stay there any longer. He turned around and headed back to where his main body was. He suddenly suspected that what the middle-aged man had wanted to do to him was not to erase him, but to make some kind of subtle change to him. Perhaps the purpose of the change was to allow him to gain independence and freedom. At the thought of this, the incarnation did not know what to think. Perhaps after being distorted and gaining independence and freedom, he would be extremely grateful to the middle-aged man. However, it was obvious that he was still Luo Fan's incarnation at this moment, and there was still no enmity between him and Luo Fan. The thoughts of such an incarnation were Luo Fan's thoughts, and his self-awareness was Luo Fan's self-awareness. In this way, it was naturally impossible for the middle-aged man to have any good impressions of him, who wanted him to gain independence and a part of him to break away from him. "It's really annoying," as he muttered. Luo Fan disappeared from this area. Time slowly flowed. Unknowingly, another few thousand years had passed in this world. During these thousands of years, at the edge of the area where Luo Fan's main body was, there were endless battles. The living beings in the space-time created by Luo Fan and the living beings in the space-time created by the will of the world outside fought for the goal of destroying each other. Of course, compared to those living beings, perhaps it would be more accurate to describe this kind of battle as a war. Over the past thousands of years, hundreds of millions of living beings had perished in this war at almost every moment. The seawater at the border had already turned a little red because of this death. Due to the faint red color, the ocean was filled with a lot of vitality. The blood of living beings was the source of vitality. When blood was splashed and blended into the seawater, it would naturally increase the vitality in the seawater, allowing all kinds of living beings that had not yet met the conditions to be born because of this vitality. Among them, some living beings had even reached a level where their blood could transform. Just the blood of such living beings was enough to naturally give birth to many races. The result of such blood being splashed was needless to say. It could be said that billions of lives were dying in this battle at every moment. Fortunately, the area that had broken free from the shackles was wide enough, and the border was long enough. Otherwise, endless baleful chi and resentment would have covered the sky and earth a long time ago. Of course, even if the border was long enough, it could not completely avoid the influence. Chapter 29-26. One day, Luo Fan suddenly felt that among the many spacetimes of the boundary, there was a strange change happening to some spacetimes. The enmity between those spacetimes and the opposite heaven and earth seemed to have disappeared without a trace. They almost turned a blind eye to the flaws revealed by the opposite spacetimes. Even the attacks from those spacetimes were powerless, as if they were just putting up a perfunctory front. This situation only happened to one or two spacetimes, so it was naturally not a big deal. After all, different spacetimes had different styles and naturally made different choices. Who knew if something had happened to that spacetime, or if there had been a change in its leader, or if it had simply been damaged because of some messy incident? There were countless reasons for that spacetime to change like this. However, that was only the case for one or two spacetimes. Now, the spacetimes that had changed were counted in millions. Millions of spacetimes had suddenly changed in sync. No matter how one looked at it, this situation could not be just a coincidence. There must be some kind of crucial change that had appeared in these spacetimes. What happened? Luo Fan was secretly curious. In his heart, he faintly felt that this might have something to do with the middle-aged man who was the embodiment of the world's will. After all, in this part of the world, apart from Luo Fan, it seemed that only the middle-aged man could break free from the control of the world's will. Under such circumstances, the existence that had broken free from the control of the worlds was very likely to be the middle-aged man who was once the embodiment of the world's will. Of course, this was only a baseless guess at the moment. As for the specifics, it would naturally depend on the subsequent investigation. Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. In the relative space-time of those space-times, relative changes would naturally begin to occur. All kinds of experts began to be pushed by some kind of inexplicable force, and they began to doubt what was happening in the opposite space-times. With this suspicion, they began to take action. They used all kinds of methods to investigate all the changes that might have occurred in the opposite space-times. In this situation, from another perspective, it was just that the fighting style between the space-times had changed from the original head-on to a completely opposite form. Of course, most of it was the space-times under Luo Fan's control seeping into the space-times created by the world, or rather, the space-times created by the worlds. Well, if it was just one or two space-times, it would not be easy and simple to get the answer. However, if there were more space-time, the situation would be completely different. With more space-time, the power to detect space-time at the same time would naturally increase. As the power of space-time detection increased, the feedback of information that could be obtained at the same time naturally began to increase. The detection feedback from one or two pieces of space-time was only a partial harvest, but when the feedback from multiple pieces of space-time was combined, they could barely piece together a complete outline. The heavenly Tao has changed. Luo Fan had a rough idea of why those space-times had changed after integrating the feedback from millions of pieces of space-time. The heavenly laws of time and space were clearly different from before. It was as if some kind of external power was seizing control of the empty heavenly Tao. This kind of seizure had not yet been completed, but it had caused a certain amount of chaos. In the end, the behavior of those space-times had changed, causing their hatred towards their corresponding space-times to disappear without a trace. These are just the space-time that shows the disappearance of the hatred. It's not all the space-times that the heavenly Tao is changing. After understanding this, Luo Fan realized that the space-times that were changing now were definitely not just the space-times that he had detected. These space-times just happened to be the space-times that showed the disappearance of the hatred towards their corresponding space-times due to the chaos of the heavenly Tao. It was very likely that they were just a very, very small part of the countless space-times where the heavenly Tao was in chaos. Among the unknown trillions of space-times on the boundary, there might be more, perhaps tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or even trillions of space-times where the heavenly Tao was changing at the same time, causing chaos. However, because those changes in the chaos were even more obscure and impossible to detect, Luo Fan did not pick them out from the unknown trillions of space-times at this time. With this thought in mind, he began to more carefully observe the unknown trillions of space-times on the boundary, and began to look for the changes in those space-times that he had overlooked before. Soon, he found many clues that had changed. A large number of space-times that might cause the heavenly Tao to be in chaos were locked by him. There were hundreds of millions of these space-times alone, and this was only the slightly obvious changes in space-times that could be discovered with just a little more concentration. Apart from such space-times, there were still more space-times that were ambiguous and seemed to have changed, but also seemed to have changed due to some kind of choice. In such a space-time, even if only half of the space-times were chaotic, the number of them was still in the trillions. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had a faint look of doubt on his face. In his heart, he had more or less confirmed that the source of the chaos was really the middle-aged man who was once the incarnation of the will of the world. However, what exactly did the middle-aged man want to achieve? Why did he attack these space-times? This was something he had no idea at all. At this time, in those space-times, the chaos of the heavenly Tao began to quickly calm down. In some space-times, external forces had won. In some spacetimes, the original heavenly Tao had won. The heavenly Tao, which was won by external forces, was directly distorted into a different appearance. It looked completely different from the original. In contrast, the spacetimes that were originally won by the heavenly Tao did not completely return to their original appearance. Because of this, compared to the original spacetimes, their performance was much worse. The spacetimes that were won by external forces had enough external forces to eliminate all the chaos caused by the previous chaos of the heavenly Tao. In the end, the spacetimes quickly returned to their normal appearance, causing all kinds of strange things to quickly disappear, and order was reestablished. The spacetimes that were originally won by the heavenly Tao were different. They did not have any other forces involved, and if they wanted to achieve any of their goals, they needed to rely on the power of their own spacetimes and their own power. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to restore the spacetimes, they would obviously be a step slower. Because they had lost order and guidance, their performance was even worse than when the heavenly Tao was in chaos. Instead, they were constantly being defeated in the battle against the opposite spacetimes, causing the situation of the war to quickly shift in the direction of their enemies gaining the upper hand. The goal of the spacetimes that were won by external forces after their change was only to protect themselves, and they did not succumb to it. On the contrary, the spacetimes within the boundary did not take the initiative to launch any malicious actions against the spacetimes. It was as if they wanted to stay out of the matter. With more spacetimes like this, the situation of the entire boundary changed in an instant. Unknowingly, the boundary began to gradually push outwards, causing the areas that had escaped the shackles of the worlds to unknowingly expand. This situation made a faint smile appear on Luo Fan's face. Although I don't know what your goal is, it is clear that our goals coincide. He muttered, with a slight thought. The movement of the spacetimes that he had created on the boundary began to change. He began to ignore the spacetimes that had obviously retracted their claws and teeth, and the spacetimes that were originally baring their fangs and brandishing their claws to hide and protect themselves. As for the spacetimes that clearly wanted to continue their previous enmity, but their standards were greatly reduced, and they seemed to have become more and more chaotic, he began to constantly oppress them. Under such a selective change of action, the boundary line began to change rapidly. The originally rather round boundary began to become uneven, and from its original round appearance, it turned into an irregular shape. The battle between spacetimes was originally an extremely simple battle between two spacetimes. However, as time passed, as this kind of battle carried out again and again, as both sides invested more and more power in this battle, and as more and more lives were invested in this battle, the region in the middle of the opposing spacetimes was gradually contaminated with the essence of the two spacetimes. The region becoming full of vitality was the greatest proof of this change. If it wasn't because of the interweaving and merging of the essence of the inside and outside, how could the region, as a battlefield, produce so much vitality? Don't forget, the vast spacetime outside the boundary was originally an area with no vitality at all, and the essence of these two spacetimes clearly represented the different essence of the region within the boundary and the region outside the boundary. In other words, the essence of the region that had escaped the shackles of the world's will and the region that had not escaped the shackles of the world's will. In this way, the victory and defeat of the two spacetimes would naturally be unknowingly linked to the nature of the battlefield. If the spacetime outside the boundary won, then the battlefield would naturally turn into an area that was locked by the shackles of the world's will. In other words, it would be an area that had lost all vitality and hope. And if the spacetime within the boundary won, the situation would be reversed. The region of the battlefield would naturally turn into an area that had escaped the shackles of the world's will. It was precisely because of this that the boundary would constantly change position with the victory and defeat of the spacetime. And this situation actually didn't appear naturally. In fact, the reason why this situation appeared was because Luo Fan and the worlds had consciously facilitated it. In the beginning, both sides had a tacit understanding to facilitate this outcome. Otherwise, what would be the point of this space-time battle on the boundary? Could it be just for the fun? At this moment, facing such an advantage, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile and began to connect the various spacetimes, causing the power of many spacetimes to flow continuously. The spacetime power that faced external forces that controlled the spacetime began to converge towards the spacetime corresponding to the spacetime within the boundary where the heavenly Tao had won and began to continuously attack that spacetime. Along with this change, the victories that the spacetime within the boundary won began to increase. After all, the fact that these spacetimes could reach a stalemate with each other meant that the strength of both sides was roughly equal. Since their strengths were roughly equal, then adding more strength from one side would naturally give the other side an absolute advantage. And at this moment, this advantage could obviously be easily turned into victory. The spacetime outside the boundary was gradually defeated. In the end, it even had to shift spacetime, causing the spacetime to retreat continuously. In the end, each of them retreated hundreds of millions of light years away before they could finally avoid the pursuit of the spacetime. In front of him, where the original battlefield was, or rather, where the original spacetime was, the boundary between the inside and outside had been pushed forward. The spacetime within the boundary had also taken a big step forward. It wasn't that the spacetime within the boundary didn't want to advance further, but because the battlefield in front was no longer the original battlefield. Without the fusion of the inside and outside essence, it was naturally impossible to advance further. If they wanted to advance further, they had to continue fighting. They had to continue to fill the battlefield with the essence of both sides. Only by changing the essence of the battlefield with enough essence could both sides have a chance to advance further. And this would obviously take a longer time. Of course, this change wasn't actually permanent. Karma and fate were extremely mysterious. In the beginning, this interweaving, this fusion, and this influence on victory and defeat might only be a situation that Luo Fan and the world will took the initiative to create. However, once the number of times this influence on victory and defeat continued to increase, when the number of changes increased to a certain extent, then this kind of karma would truly be established. At that time, even if there was no fusion of essence on the battlefield, the victory or defeat between the two spacetimes would truly be linked to the direction in which the boundary was pushed. In the end, it would result in one side continuously winning, and the boundary would continue to push forward, regardless of whether the other side's spacetime was retreating or whether the battlefield had gathered enough essence that belonged to both sides. Of course, this situation hadn't happened for the time being. This kind of distorted karma hadn't truly been established yet. Chapter 29-27. If it was just an ordinary cause and effect, it would naturally be an extremely simple matter to construct it. After all, Luo Fan could now sense various existences at the level of cause and effect at will. To him, as long as he made a certain change at the level of cause and effect, he would naturally be able to change a certain cause and effect, or sever a certain cause and effect, or construct a certain cause and effect. However, it was obvious that the scope of the change cause and effect that could be rented was definitely limited. With the size of the world's will and Luo Fan's current ability to control the level, it was obviously an impossible task for him to change the cause and effect that he could truly affect the world's will, and thus the entire world. If he could do it, he would have directly divided the dimension to envelop the entire world and completely destroy it. Why would he need any other messy measures? Therefore, directly changing the cause and effect in the level of cause and effect, or directly performing a remarkable ability in the level of reality to distort and confiscate the cause and effect, would obviously not be able to completely link the outcome of the battle with the position of the boundary. Only through such a conventional method could it be possible to make use of the world itself and Luo Fan's power, strength, and status to perfect the cause and effect bit by bit, and finally completely take shape. Of course, it was naturally not easy to completely form the cause and effect through such a method. It required a lot of time and energy, as well as the tacit cooperation of both parties. If one party suddenly regretted halfway, the final cause and effect would obviously not be able to take shape. At this time, it was only the first push of dozens of times. There was still an incomparably long way to truly form the cause and effect. This time, although Luo Fan's side had won, it was obviously only a small victory. Be it Luo Fan or the world's will, they did not think that this victory could determine the overall situation. Therefore, even the side of the world's will that had failed just now did not regret it, and did not continue the construction of this cause and effect. The victorious space-time absorbed the dividends of the war and obtained great growth. This kind of growth obviously required time. As for those failed space-times, they obviously need to work hard to recover from the losses in the war, which obviously takes a lot of time. If it was in an ordinary world, such a situation would almost decide the outcome of the battle. From now on, the victorious side would bring more and more victories, while the loser would fall completely. The victorious side would gain an advantage, and the gap between them and the loser would widen. When the next battle begins, the chances of winning would naturally be higher. The next victory would begin the next round of the cycle. Just like that, the outcome of the battle would be determined. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan and the worlds were not willing to decide the outcome of the battle in a single battle. After all, none of them had absolute confidence that they could emerge victorious on every battlefield. Therefore, those spacetimes had many characteristics that normal spacetimes did not have. That was the independence of time. In those spacetimes, as long as the spacetimes inside and outside were separated, then the flow of time inside would no longer have any relationship with the flow of time outside. In other words, one day in the outside world could pass any time inside that space-time. Perhaps it was a moment, perhaps it was a split second, perhaps it was 10 days, 100 days, 10 years, 100 years, or even billions of years. In such a situation, after every failure, there would be a new beginning. No matter how serious the damage to the space-time was last time, no matter how much power was consumed in that space-time, no matter how many experts died in it. When the next battle began, the situation might change dramatically. The victorious side might be at a disadvantage in terms of development, while the defeated side might gain more advantages and grow more perfectly than the victorious side. In this way, every battle could almost be regarded as a new beginning. The victory or defeat of the previous battle had almost no relationship with the victory or defeat of the next battle. This greatly increased the randomness of the victory or defeat of the war, made the outcome of the war more suspenseful, and made the process of establishing this cause and effect more exciting, with more possibilities. Clearly, whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, this possibility was the fundamental reason why they were willing to form a tacit agreement. If there were not so many possibilities, whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, it was obvious that neither of them would be willing to establish this cause and effect. And the impact of this possibility on the war was naturally to make the war last longer, making the time it would take for this cause and effect to be established even longer. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had obtained the first victory, began to shift his attention from the spacetimes outside the boundary that belonged to the world's will to the other spacetimes that had originally been seized by external forces. Those spacetimes had already undergone tremendous changes. They were vaguely breaking away from the tacit agreement that Luo Fan and the world's will had established. In other words, they were vaguely breaking away from the various restrictions that Luo Fan and the world's will had set at the same time. I see. How interesting. Suddenly, a voice rang in Luo Fan's ears. At the same time, a thunderous roar suddenly erupted in the sky out of nowhere. The thunderous roar was so loud, and the range it affected was so vast that it almost enveloped all the spacetimes on the boundary, causing all the living beings in the billions of spacetimes to simultaneously feel an indescribable anger emerging from the depths of their hearts. It really is you. What exactly do you want to achieve? Luo Fan sighed and said. The terrifying thunderous roar that covered all the spacetimes on the boundary and was heard by all the living beings in all the spacetimes was clearly from the world's will. Only the anger of the world's will could spread across such a vast area at the same time. And the only one who could make the world will so angry was naturally the middle-aged man who had betrayed the world's will. However, although Luo Fan was sure that the middle-aged man was involved in all of this, he still had no idea where the middle-aged man was at this moment. At this moment, he could only sense that the middle-aged man's aura was faintly present in those space-times, as if he had directly treated those space-times as the carrier of his existence. This method was extremely brilliant. Even Luo Fan couldn't determine the middle-aged man's location at all, and he couldn't even be sure if he had really come to this area, or in other words, this boundary. My goal is, of course, to survive. Isn't this obvious? At this moment, a voice resounded in Luo Fan's ears. It was the middle-aged man's voice. The source of this voice was unknown, and it seemed to exist in all matter and laws, but also seemed to be just an illusion that Luo Fan had. At this moment, the void became dark, and the thunderous roar appeared again. Countless living beings in the countless space-times in the void once again felt the fear that they had felt before at the same time. It was unknown how many existences were completely annihilated in this thunderous roar. In just an instant, an endless amount of electricity appeared in the form of threads on both sides of the border, directly shattering the huge amount of void on both sides of the border, making everything on both sides of the border look like it was formed by the accumulation of fragments. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression turned solemn. This was the will of the universe taking action. At this moment, he felt that everything that seemed to be the source of the voice was destroyed by the will of the universe at the same time. This place no longer belongs to you alone. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a slight thought, the fragments on both sides of the border instantly gathered again, and in the blink of an eye, it had returned to the state before it was destroyed, as if nothing had happened. Why bother? What's here now is just a little bit of my power. So what if it's destroyed? At this moment, the voice sounded again. However, although it was heard by Luo Fan this time, its target was clearly not Luo Fan. In Luo Fan's ears, the voice seemed rather distant, as if it was transmitted from the horizon. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan naturally understood that this existence was speaking to the will of the universe. You're a part of me. No matter how much time passes, and no matter what changes you make, you can't change this. At this moment, an extremely sonorous voice resounded in the world. However, although this voice was much more sonorous than the thunderous roar from before, it was also indescribably mysterious. Although it resounded throughout the heavens and earth, apart from existences at Luo Fan's level, it was impossible for any other existences to understand this voice. Even if this voice was just speaking, they would not be able to understand its content at all, and would not be able to determine what it was saying. So you're just a part of the predestined fate. Why are you wasting time now? At this moment, the voice that belonged to the middle-aged man rang out again. It still sounded extremely distant. The voice that belonged to the will of the universe in the sky did not ring out again. It seemed like the middle-aged man's words had poked a certain sore spot of the will of the universe. And it also seemed like the will of the universe had made up its mind to eliminate the middle-aged man. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he suddenly sighed in his heart. Looks like he's made up his mind to eliminate me. Next, perhaps we can form an alliance. At this moment, the middle-aged man's voice rang out in Luo Fan's ears. Compared to before, the middle-aged man's voice had lost its distant characteristic. It sounded like it was not far away or even right next to him. At this time, facing such a voice, Luo Fan only faintly said, "Alliance? Even the weak can resist the strong? That sounds good. However, I don't believe you. Perhaps this is just a show that you're putting on." Just a show? Do you think you're qualified to make us put on this show? The middle-aged man's voice seemed to be suppressing some sort of disdain. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. He only nodded indifferently and said, "That's right. I think I'm qualified." His words did not follow common sense at all, and it made the middle-aged man speechless for a moment. After a long while, his helpless voice rang out again. "You're thinking too much. Among the three of us, you're definitely the weakest. If it wasn't for the existence of that power behind you, you would have been crushed to death by now. Why would you need to care about your own power? You're just changing the concept, Luo Fan said indifferently, but he was not moved at all. The middle-aged man did not know what to say for a moment. There was no way to persuade Luo Fan just now, so no matter what he said next, it would obviously be useless. If he wanted to make Luo Fan truly sure that what he said was true, he could only produce strong evidence to prove this point. However, for now, it was clear that the strong evidence was to make Luo Fan feel how weak he was. It was to make Luo Fan completely understand that he was the weakest among the three parties. Moreover, he was the party that was countless times weaker than the other two parties. Once he did that, he would obviously have to attack Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, doing that was almost equivalent to shedding all pretense of cordiality with Luo Fan. Obviously, this was not a choice that he could make. If he could not do that, then there was no way to change Luo Fan's mind. All right, I can't make you believe this. The middle-aged man sighed and could only change his original plan. Next, he did not contact Luo Fan again. Instead, he began to make further changes to the space-time that he controlled, so that the space-time that was originally breaking away from the tacit understanding between Luo Fan and the will of heaven and earth would gradually regain that tacit understanding. Furthermore, he began to build new rules on top of that tacit understanding. Chapter 29-28. That kind of power brought about an unimaginable chain reaction. Those spacetimes underwent increasingly intense changes due to that power. The nomological laws, time, space, matter, energy, and everything else seemed to be gradually distorted by that power. Those spacetimes had originally stopped their malice towards all spacetimes, whether it was towards the spacetimes that Luo Fan had opened up on the other side of the boundary, or toward the other spacetimes that were still under the control of the will of the world. However, all of this was changed by that inexplicable power. A kind of hostility gradually emerged from those spacetimes. This wasn't just an enmity directed at one of the three parties, but a common enmity directed at the other two parties. In other words, it was not just a hostility towards the spacetimes that Luo Fan had opened up on the other side of the boundary, but it was also a strong hostility towards the spacetimes that were still under the control of the will of the world. With this hostility, the style of those spacetimes began to change. Their original reserved attitude was completely broken. Instead, it was replaced by an unimaginable aggressiveness. Although there was no army yet, many living beings were sent out to explore other spacetimes that did not belong to them with the purpose of fighting. This was the case whether it was the spacetimes that belonged to Luo Fan or the spacetimes that belonged to the will of the world. Do you intend to use force? Luo Fan frowned at this time. This was clearly a fait accompli that the incarnation of the former will of the world intended to forcibly create a situation in which the three sides competed for hegemony. The three-way hegemony was obviously an extremely complicated battle situation. Joining forces with the weak to resist the strong was almost a basic operation in a hegemony battle. If such a situation was really created, even if Luo Fan did not trust the incarnation of the former will of the world, he was afraid that he would eventually be forced to cooperate with it due to the situation. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was secretly a little displeased. Anyone who was forced by others to accept something that they were originally unwilling to accept would not feel very good. At this moment, a large patch of dark clouds appeared out of thin air. As if blotting out the sky and covering the earth, it completely covered the millions of spacetimes that had been controlled by the incarnation of the former will of the world. After the appearance of these dark clouds, an indescribable pressure naturally appeared. Rumbling sounds of thunder began to explode from the dark clouds. Then, an unknown number of lightning bolts were emitted from the dark clouds and blasted down on the millions of spacetimes below. In the blink of an eye, the countless lightning bolts had already brazenly inserted into the countless spacetimes and began to collide intensely with the barrier on the surface of that spacetime. Countless living beings that belonged to those spacetimes but did not belong to those spacetimes for various reasons died in an instant. These bolts of lightning were lightning that targeted space-time, and they possessed unimaginable destructive power. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was for living beings to resist these bolts of lightning. It was naturally impossible for the living beings that belonged to those space-times to resist the lightning. From the moment they encountered the lightning, their deaths were already completely determined. The dark clouds continued to condense and thicken in the void. They did not stop even though the lightning had already exploded. It was as if there was an infinite source of power behind the dark clouds that was constantly emitting power to replenish the dark clouds. Although the lightning was constantly flickering and striking down, the sky was still visibly darkening and becoming terrifying. The millions of space-times seemed extremely fragile in the face of the lightning. Although the lightning was obstructed by the space-time barrier and paused for a long time outside the space-time, in the end, when the lightning continued to strengthen, the barrier still could not withstand the lightning and broke open. The lightning frantically surged in and began to wreak havoc, constantly destroying everything within the space-time. In just the blink of an eye, the living beings within the space-time had already been annihilated. The laws within the space-time had already become chaotic under the destruction of the lightning, not to mention the existence of time and space. As the lightning wreaked havoc, everything was being destroyed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan fell into deep thought, but he did not make any move to help the space-time. At this moment, the former worlds will seem to be at an absolute disadvantage, as if the space-time was already on the verge of destruction. However, Luo Fan understood in his heart that there would definitely be a turning point after this. There was no other reason other than the fact that the performance of the former worlds was simply too poor. Based on Luo Fan's understanding of the former world's will, even if it was just the space-time that it had just gained control of, it would still be able to exert power that was billions of times greater than what it was displaying now. Just the defensive ability alone was impossible to only display a little bit of power at this moment. Yet, under such circumstances, the space-time was actually so fragile. Even a fool would not believe that there was nothing wrong with it, let alone Luo Fan. Since he clearly knew that there was something wrong with the other party, and everything that was happening in front of him was just a facade and not the truth, how stupid would Luo Fan have to be to get involved and take the initiative to be used? The dark clouds that appeared out of nowhere in the sky became denser and more terrifying, and the lightning within also became brighter and more dazzling. Within the lightning, a power that far exceeded the original lightning gradually appeared, and it started to continuously mix with the lightning, causing the power of the lightning to become stronger, more agile, and more autonomous. Its destruction of the space-time also became more and more thorough. Finally, at a certain moment, when the intensity of the lightning reached a certain limit, a strange, shattering sound spread throughout the void. The space-time that was able to withstand the lightning finally couldn't withstand the attack of the lightning. Under the lightning, it completely disintegrated and turned into countless fragments that spread in all directions along with the impact of the explosion of the lightning. It shattered. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan was slightly puzzled. However, he still believed in his previous conjecture. He felt that this was just an intermediate process, and the turning point was still later, so he still did not take any action at this time. Obviously, the worlds will seem to think so too. At this time, even though the space-time had already disintegrated and turned into countless space-time fragments, it still did not stop. It continued to continuously strengthen the power of the dark clouds, increasing the changes in the lightning within the dark clouds. In other words, it was continuously strengthening the attack on the space-time fragments. If it was not for the fact that the former world was still certain that the incarnation still had a way to reverse the situation, why would it waste its power like this? At this moment, just when Luo Fan and the worlds were certain that the former worlds still had a way to reverse the situation, the dark clouds and the void suddenly began to surge. The surging dark clouds had existed from the beginning, and the reason why it was mentioned now was that the surging that had just begun was completely different from the surging that had appeared before. Although it seemed like the dark clouds were surging, this kind of surging was completely incompatible with the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds. They had a strong conflict with the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds. Amidst this conflict, the lightning within the dark clouds became chaotic, and a large amount of lightning began to attack the other lightning. Endless destructive power directly erupted within the dark clouds. This strange surging continued to strengthen, and the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds gradually retreated under this surging. In just a brief moment, before the will of the heavens and earth could even react, 60% of the dark clouds had already changed owners. When the worlds will finally shifted its attention from below to the dark clouds, the part of the dark clouds that had changed owners had already been completely separated from the rest of the dark clouds. Instead, it began to encircle the dark clouds that had yet to change owners and unleashed endless attacks on them. Compared to the original dark clouds, these dark clouds that had changed owners had an additional power that was different from the original dark clouds. This power fused with the attacks of the dark clouds, causing the attacks of the dark clouds to skyrocket by several times. Under this surge of attacks, the dark clouds that had yet to change owners and still belonged to the worlds will quickly collapse. By the time the worlds will had regrouped, there was less than 10% of the dark clouds left. How dare you? The world's will's voice smashed down from the void. The void distorted intensely under this voice, and a kind of destructive might directly suppress the void to the point that it began to distort strangely. It was as if everything had succumbed to this voice. Endless power was continuously born from the void, frantically pouring into the remaining dark clouds that had less than 10% of the dark clouds. It was doing its best to strengthen the dark clouds and allow them to escape from the predicament of only 10% of the dark clouds remaining. However, it was a pity that as the dark clouds strengthened, the remaining dark clouds that had changed owners also began to strengthen at the same time. As the remaining 10% of the dark clouds strengthened, the remaining 90% of the dark clouds also strengthened by the same amount. It was as if the power and power being poured into the dark clouds was also continuously strengthening the dark clouds that had changed owners. At that moment, Luo Fan seemed to sense something. With a thought, a wave of suppressive power swept over and instantly enveloped the area that was covered by the dark clouds for billions of light years. Under this suppressive power, everything in the void instantly came to a standstill. It was as if an unimaginable power had directly stopped time completely. As expected, at that moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He casually grabbed at the void, and the suppressive power began to squirm and change slightly. Immediately after, some invisible existence was pushed by the suppressive power and started to continuously gather towards where he was. It was a kind of authority, the authority to control this part of the world. It originally belonged to the dark clouds in the sky and was also the fundamental authority that existed in this large area. Of course, the authority that was gathering towards Luo Fan was only the authority contained in the destroyed 30% of the dark clouds. It was also the portion of authority that the world's will and the former incarnation of the worlds were fighting over. That's right, the changes in the dark clouds seemed intense, but that wasn't the focus of their fight. Only this authority and this authority were the focus of their fight. Power was nothing to existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others. As long as they wanted to, they could casually create unlimited power at any time. For example, the power contained in the dark clouds and the power contained in the lightning were obviously nothing to them. As long as they wanted to, let alone these dark clouds, even if there were hundreds or thousands of times more dark clouds, they could casually create them. Since that was the case, if it was purely for power, there was naturally no need for them to fight over and destroy the dark clouds. Only the authority that belonged to this part of the world, and a certain kind of authority that belonged to this part of the world, was something that they couldn't casually create. This was also the focus of their fight. Previously, the former incarnation of the worlds had occupied 60% of the dark clouds, which clearly meant that it had completely occupied 60% of the authority. After that, it had destroyed the remaining 30% of the dark clouds because it had been discovered. This had caused the remaining 30% of the authority to collapse and scatter across the world, causing the worlds to be unable to directly control the authority. This gave it more time and more opportunities to control the authority. Now, what Luo Fan had done was to rely on the suppressive power to forcibly gather the scattered authority and make it fall into his hands. At this moment, another Luo Fan appeared out of thin air in front of Luo Fan. This was another incarnation of Luo Fan, which was also the incarnation that had fought with the former incarnation of the world's will in the space-time core of the world. It was also an incarnation formed by the power derived from the collision with the power related to the true divine. At this moment, after this incarnation arrived, it casually made a grabbing motion and the authority quickly gathered in front of it. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into an extremely simple and unadorned seal. It floated in the air and emitted an indescribable, mysterious charm. Rumble, the three-legged cauldron in the hands of the other incarnation of Luo Fan, vibrated slightly, as if some kind of incredible power was attacking the three-legged cauldron and starting to shake its power. Chapter 2929. This suppressive force could even suppress time, so it was natural that it could exist for a long time. If there was no resistance that could shake this suppressive force, let alone a short while, even billions of years or trillions of years would be nothing to this suppressive force. However, it was clear that this did not exist. At this moment, the world's will and the former world's will's incarnation both possessed great resistance against this suppressive force. At this moment, the resistance within the suppressive force was constantly strengthening. Vaguely, the resistance from the two sides seemed to have an inexplicable cooperation. Their powers complemented each other, and they started to shake the almost absolute suppressive force. At this moment, the cooperation between the two resistance was only at an extremely preliminary stage. They complemented each other, and most of the time, they did not interfere with each other. However, it was clear that the resistance could not remain at this level forever. As long as this suppressive force continued to exist, the cooperation between the resistance would definitely continue to deepen. Whether the strengthening of the resistance would have any effect on the suppressive force was secondary. More importantly, what this deepening represented was rather disadvantageous to Luo Fan. This was the deepening of the cooperation, and it clearly meant that the conflict between the world's will and the former world's will's incarnation was gradually easing, and there were signs of an alliance. This was something that Luo Fan did not want to see. Of course, if the suppressive force could really get rid of the world's will and the former world's incarnation, then he would naturally not care about the trend of the two forming an alliance. However, the suppressive force clearly could not do that. It must be known that whether it was the world's will or the former world's incarnation, none of them were in their true forms. There was no need to say anything more about the world's will. Its true form was in the depths of the void, in the space-time where the world's will resided. What was here was only a little power spreading down, and it was not even an incarnation. It was the same for the former world's incarnation. At this moment, even the world's will could not find it. What was here was also just a little power. Under such circumstances, what would be the result of erasing both of them in an instant? At most, they would just destroy this place of karma that was constructed by mutual tacit understanding. For this, it was clearly not a smart choice to risk the world's will and the former world's incarnation forming an alliance against him. And Luo Fan was obviously smart enough. Hence, at this moment, when he sensed the resistance that erupted from the suppressive power, he silently withdrew the suppressive power. The surroundings instantly became lively again. It was as if the existence that had stopped time had once again allowed time to flow. At this moment, the dark clouds went silent. Immediately after, the battle that was about to reach its climax completely stopped. Regardless of whether it was the portion of dark clouds controlled by the former incarnation of the world's will, or the portion that was still under the control of the world's will, both of them began to converge at this moment. In the end, they turned into a seemingly solid cloud layer that hung high in the void. In the end, it's still 30%. Luo Fan sighed and looked at the 60% dark clouds with an inexplicable expression. The 60% dark clouds were the dark clouds controlled by the former incarnation of the will of the world. They contained 60% of the authority over this large region. The 60% authority, along with the 30% authority in Luo Fan's hands and the 10% authority in the world's will's hands, formed 100% authority over this vast region. Obtaining this 100% authority was equivalent to completely controlling this large region. Once this large region was controlled, it would be equivalent to completely dividing this large region from the hands of the world's will, allowing this large region to have a new owner. If Luo Fan obtained this authority, this region would become a source of power for him to resist the world's will. If the former incarnation of the world's will controlled this authority, it would be equivalent to him having a foothold, and he would no longer need to hide from the world's will like now. The former incarnation of the world's will had yet to appear. Luo Fan and the world's will had only confirmed that the incarnation had participated in this battlefield by relying on its familiarity with the incarnation. This seemed very mysterious, and it seemed that the former incarnation of the world's will had a very brilliant method. However, wasn't this also a form of helplessness? If it wasn't for the fact that the former incarnation of the world's will did not dare to appear in front of the world's will and did not dare to directly face the world's will, why would he need to use these various methods to control time and space? Why would he not even be able to directly appear on this battlefield? If he could really personally appear on this battlefield and face the world's will, perhaps he would not obtain any more advantages than now, but it would definitely be many times easier than now. However, if he had his own foothold and was able to grasp all the authority in this region would obviously become his base. With this base, from today onwards, the former incarnation of the worlds would no longer be water without a source or a tree without roots. At this step, he would truly have the qualifications to challenge the world's will. Of course, it was only the qualifications. Although this region was vast and boundless, and it could only be calculated in billions of light years, it was still an insignificant. However, compared to the entire world, it was still an insignificant. The difficulty of relying on this region to defeat the world's will was almost as difficult as an ant trying to conquer the entire universe. However, no matter how difficult it was still a breakthrough from 0 to 1. For the former incarnation of the world's will, its importance was obvious. Fellow, why don't you give this authority to me? I don't care what you want, as long as I have it. At this moment, a voice rang in Luo Fan's ears. This was the incarnation of the former world's will. The way it spoke was still extremely subtle and mysterious. It was as if everything in the world was speaking at the same time, but it was also as if a supreme being who was billions of light years away was locking onto this area and transmitting his voice. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly, and the incarnation that was holding the seal shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. He used his own actions to directly express his attitude. The former incarnation of the worlds could only sigh. He naturally knew that the possibility of Luo Fan agreeing to his request was extremely slim, and he had only spoken up with a sliver of hope. Now that Luo Fan had rejected him cleanly, it was within his expectations. Therefore, there was naturally no need for him to act like he was embarrassed into anger. For Luo Fan, his own base was not absolutely necessary. After all, he now had a large region that had been freed from the control of the world's will. The region that had been freed from the shackles of the world's will was the source of his power, and it was where he relied on to resist the world's will. In comparison, an additional region was just icing on the cake for him. It was not considered timely help at all. If one were to be truly rational, it did not seem unacceptable to give this authority to the incarnation of the former world's will. However, it was clear that the current Luo Fan could not do such a thing. Icing on the cake was also an addition, and it was also a benefit. Even though the incarnation of the former world's will was extremely close to him, and seemed to want to form an alliance with him, and was completely on the same side as him. However, this was only temporary. It was because he was forced by the situation. Seriously speaking, the incarnation of the former world's will and the world's will were actually on the same side. They were both born because of his seventh great calamity. If they wanted to continue to exist, they would eventually stand opposite him, and they would definitely fight to the death with him. As long as the time was right, such a thing would definitely happen. Since he knew that the other party would definitely stand on the opposite side, Luo Fan naturally would not pour his heart out to him, and naturally would not do things like giving benefits to the other party. Cooperation was cooperation. At most, he would cooperate with the other party, and in the process of fighting, he would only go around the other party to a certain extent. As for the benefits, not stopping the other party from taking them was already very principled. The normal way of doing things was to see benefits in cooperation. Even if it was benefits that had been previously agreed upon, the bottom line should be to seize as much as possible in the end. It was impossible to hand over benefits to the other party without even thinking about it. The incarnation of the former worlds will obviously saw it very clearly. After being rejected by Luo Fan, it no longer continued to dwell on this topic and began to use the 60% authority that it had in this area to start a limited control of this area. For a moment, the world trembled and time distorted. The countless space-time fragments that were originally shattered began to expand crazily like balloons at this moment. In just a few breaths' time, the huge amount of space-time fragments had already expanded into complete space-time. Originally, there were only millions of space-time fragments here. However, at this time, as the fragments expanded into complete space-time, the number of space-time directly increased by God knows how many billions of times. From the original millions of space-time, it turned into billions of space-time. The countless space-time densely gathered together, like stars in the void, full of vitality and extraordinarily lively. All of this was caused by the incarnation of the former worlds while using its authority to manipulate the rules, laws, energy, and matter in this area to repair and perfect the space-time fragments. During this process, Luo Fan actually had the ability to stop it. After all, he also had 30% authority in this area. This authority was naturally not enough to directly distort the action of the 60% authority, but it was absolutely easy to stop it and prevent it from going so smoothly. However, it was clear that at that time, Luo Fan did not take any action at all. He just sat back and watched as the other party perfected these space-time and obtained a large number of space-time to participate in this war, or rather, to construct the cause and effect here. He had the right to stop it, but he did not, and the world's will was powerless. Luo Fan still had 30% authority and could slightly shake the 60% authority. However, the will of the heavens and earth only possessed 10% of this authority. This 10% authority might have some effect on Luo Fan's 30% authority, and it could slightly distort the various orders issued by Luo Fan's 30% authority. However, for the incarnation of the former world's will's 60% authority, the effect was quite limited. The 60% authority only needed to be slightly guarded against, and it would be enough to make the 10% authority useless, unable to distort it in any way. The final result was like this. The incarnation of the former worlds will obtain who knows how many billions of space-time to participate in this tacit war of cause and effect. Although on the whole, the worlds could not fundamentally stop the birth of these space-time, it was clearly not completely helpless. At this time, when these space-time had just been formed, and before civilizations similar to other space-time had really been born, the space-time under the control of the worlds will begin to move. A large number of living beings began to set out from those space-time and attacked the newly born space-time. They wanted to take advantage of the situation where those space-time had just been born and did not have enough powerful support to get rid of them first. Even with 60% authority, the incarnation of the former worlds did not have any shortcuts to this kind of attack. It could only do its best to guide the power in those space-time to resist the invaders. After all, This was the requirement of the cause and effect construction. With the ability of the incarnation of the former world's will, it could naturally directly take action and easily wipe out the invaders. But that would obviously destroy the tacit understanding between the three parties. At that time, this tacit understanding of cause and effect construction would no longer have any meaning. In that case, not only would the worlds will not tolerate him, but even Luo Fan would also directly attack him. Therefore, at this time, even if the many space-time powers that he had constructed were at a low point, he could only let those space-time powers resist the invaders. Chapter 29:30. In the beginning, the power controlled by the worlds was naturally victorious, while the space-time controlled by the former worlds was gradually defeated. But soon, the space-time controlled by the former worlds began to erupt with a strong resistance. More and more living beings took advantage of the space-time near the edge being defeated to quickly gather power, give birth to living beings, and nurture a cultivation civilization. In the end, when the attacks landed on the space-time had already gathered a certain amount of resistance. This was also because the space-time was independent, which was why such a change occurred. Because the space-time was independent, no matter how much time passed in the outside world, it did not have much effect on the inside. In other words, only a few breaths might have passed in the outside world, but billions of years might have passed in the space-time. It was precisely because of this characteristic that the former incarnation of the will of the world had enough time to nurture enough resistance. The space-time's resistance became stronger and stronger as time passed. In the end, when nearly 30% of the space-time was defeated, the remaining space-time finally produced enough power to fight against the other two sides. The commotion caused by the battle increased by who knows how many times. It finally had the atmosphere of one of the three sides. Seeing this, the worlds did not stop. Instead, it pushed forward its own power, sending more living beings and experts to suppress the space-time formed by the former world's will. It planned to take advantage of the situation and defeat the former world's will in an all-out war. The former world's will incarnation was powerful enough, and the space-time it controlled had gathered enough living beings. But it still did not have enough foundation. The power was still a little superficial. In the face of an all-out war, although its performance was commendable, it was still being defeated overall. This defeat would not cause the space-time of the former worlds to be completely destroyed. After all, the space-time was the foundation of its power, and it could not be created at will. Under such circumstances, the power derived from the space-time could be destroyed and erased, but the space-time must be preserved no matter what. Therefore, it was not only the incarnation of the world's will, but also the world's will and Luo Fan's will. In the process of battle, once time and space failed, and everything was completely exposed to the enemy's destructive power, it would definitely shift the time and space at the first instant. It would directly cause time and space to retreat, giving way to the place where the time and space were originally located. It would rather lose its territory than lose time and space. At this moment, the incarnation of the former worlds was no exception. Although they were constantly losing in the battle, they had perfectly protected their own space-time. Even if there were millions or tens of millions of space-times that were on the verge of being destroyed, there was not a single space-time that was truly destroyed in the end. However, on the other hand, the territory that they occupied was reduced by more than a tenth. Space-time could protect him and allow him to escape, but not his territory. As for why the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth didn't continue to open up space-time and give birth to living beings, just like how the fragments turned into complete space-time. The reason was the same as how he couldn't directly attack the living beings that were attacking the space-time that he controlled. This was the requirement of constructing karma. If you wanted to participate in this game, you had to obediently follow the rules. Otherwise, you could play by yourself. Seeing that the space-time controlled by the worlds was constantly nibbling away at the territory that the incarnation of the former worlds controlled, Luo Fan finally had no choice but to take action. Although he didn't intend to let the incarnation of the former worlds participate in this, it had now indeed participated in this battle. But now, It had indeed participated, and it had forcefully torn off a large portion of its authority from the will of the world. Naturally, he couldn't sit back and watch as the world will took back that portion of authority. Therefore, at this moment, when the world was constantly nibbling away at the territory of the incarnation of the former world's will, it was faintly shaking the 60% authority that the incarnation of the former worlds will had over this region. He could only sigh, and with a thought, he let the space-time that he controlled erupt with power and attack the territory of the world's will. This kind of attack wasn't out of the world's will's expectations. However, it didn't produce any sudden sneak attacks. The world's will didn't suffer much because of this. Naturally, it didn't occupy territory at all. However, at the same time, this kind of attack was not completely ineffective. At the very least, under this kind of attack, the world's will was no longer able to expand its advantage over the incarnation of the former world's will. After all, the space-time power that the world's will controlled was ultimately limited. If it diverted some power in one direction, the power in the other direction would be weakened. Now, it clearly had to have enough power to resist the attack of the space-time that Luo Fan controlled. The attack that was diverted towards the incarnation of the former worlds will naturally weakened. Authority and territory did not correspond to one another. Authority only represented the strength of control, not the breadth of control. Therefore, the territory occupied by the incarnation of the former world's will with 60% authority was the smallest among the three parties. It wasn't even 1% of the other two parties' territories. However, the territory occupied by the world's will with only 10% authority was the largest among the three parties. It was even 2 or 3 times larger than the territory controlled by Luo Fan. The size of the territory represented the amount of resources it had and the strength of its foundation. Obviously, among the three parties, the world's will had the most resources and the strongest foundation. Therefore, even if he only had 10% of the authority in this area, his overall strength was still the strongest among the three parties. Of course, the world's will had the boundless world outside as its backer and could continuously absorb the resources it needed from there. Meanwhile, Luo Fan could also obtain support from the area that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will. Both parties were barely equal. Even though there was a huge disparity in the size of the area, compared to these space-times, whether it was the area that had broken free from the shackles or the wider space-time outside, they could be considered to be infinitely vast. What restricted these space-times from absorbing resources and foundation was not the size of those areas, but the ability of those space-times to absorb and digest resources. In this way, even if there was a huge disparity between the breadth of the two backers, it wouldn't affect the support those space-times received much. In contrast, the incarnation of the worlds did not have such convenience. For it, its only backer now was the incarnation of the worlds will itself. Or to be more specific, it was the extremely high intrinsic power that formed the incarnation of the world's will. However, although the intrinsic power was high, its scale could not compare to the vast area of the world. Therefore, this difference in backer caused the territory of the incarnation of the worlds to be much shallower than the territories controlled by Luo Fan and the world's will. If it was not for the fact that it had 60% authority, which far surpassed Luo Fan and the world's will, it would not have had the right to establish a foothold here and become one of the three parties. However, even so, the main body of the war could not become the incarnation of the world's will. The main body of the war was still Luo Fan and the world's will. It could be said that although the incarnation of the worlds had forcibly torn a line in the battlefield and inserted itself into the battlefield that it could not have inserted itself into, it was ultimately just a form of adjustment. Due to their own reasons, Luo Fan and the worlds would pay attention to the incarnation of the world's will. However, if they did not pay attention to it, its existence would not have much of an impact on the situation. Under the rules of the battlefield, once the space-time made a move, there would be a connection between the space-time and the space-time, and the independence of the space-time would naturally be lost. This meant that once the space-time sent forces to participate in the war, the space-time would also lose the qualification to continue brewing power and nurture its own living beings and powerhouses. Therefore, by sending forces to hold back the enemy, one's own space-time would continue to grow and develop for millions of years in a short period of time. It would be impossible for it to grow for hundreds of millions of years. Of course, there were also many loopholes in this. However, as time passed, as the war progressed, and as the cause and effect gradually took effect, those loopholes were naturally filled up more and more. As a result, the rules of the battlefield on both sides naturally became more and more perfect. The battle that followed was not one-sided. Between Luo Fan and the world's will, neither side would always win and the other side would always lose. In the first place, the battle strength of both sides was not much different. Naturally, both sides would win and lose. Occasionally, it would be Luo Fan who would win, and occasionally, it would be the world's will who would win. However, because the cause and effect had yet to be truly constructed, the outcome of this battle was more dependent on the transformation of the environment at the intersection of their territories, so that at a certain moment, when the conditions were right, the nature of the battle would naturally be linked to the overall outcome. Therefore, although both sides had wins and losses, there were not too many fluctuations in each other's territories. On one side, the battlefield was in full swing. On the other side, the incarnation of the former will of the world was also very good at stirring shit. Sometimes it would attack the will of the world, and sometimes it would attack Luo Fan. As long as one side gained the upper hand, it would attack. Thus, it would do its best to balance the power of both sides and maintain the overall situation of the battlefield in the most advantageous state. Although this method was annoying, it could also be considered as an active transformation of the environment at the intersection of the three sides. The power of the three sides intertwined at the intersection, and the living beings that belonged to the three sides continuously died there. Essence and blood continuously seeped into the seawater and the void, and finally, the intersection gradually gained the characteristics of the three sides. This characteristic was not too strong now, but as time passed, this characteristic would definitely gradually strengthen. At a certain point, this characteristic would definitely make the location at the intersection truly linked to the victory and defeat of the three sides. Time continued to pass in this seemingly orderly, yet seemingly chaotic war. Unknowingly, more than 10,000 years had passed. Whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the incarnation of the world's will, all of them clearly knew that it was almost time. In these 10,000 years, the number of battles that broke out between the three sides would probably be counted in the hundreds of millions. At the intersection of the three sides' territories, the characteristics of space-time, matter, and laws had almost truly intertwined with the characteristics of the three sides. In other words, the ownership of those territories was almost truly linked to the victory and defeat of the war. Although it was said to be the intersection of the three sides, only a small area that belonged to the incarnation of the worlds will truly belong to the three sides. As for the other, even wider boundary, it was the boundary between the territories of Luo Fan and the will of the heavens and earth. In other words, even if Luo Fan and the worlds did not obstruct the incarnation of the former world's will, at most, it could only occupy a small area around the former world's will and turn it into its own territory. For both sides, this was only a small and insignificant territory, and it did not matter at all. As for Luo Fan and the world's will itself, if they were to sit back and watch each other attack, the final outcome would be something that neither side would be willing to bear. Therefore, it was self-evident what Luo Fan and the worlds were guarding against. The former incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth also took advantage of this opportunity to amass its own strength. It planned to take advantage of the opportunity to expand its territory once again so that it could obtain greater battle potential and become an indispensable part of the three parties. The opportunity came very quickly. When the final battle to make up for the characteristics of the intersection was completed, the ownership of the territory at the intersection of the three sides was truly linked to the victory and defeat of the next war. The three sides coincidentally fell into the calm before the storm. The three sides began to gather their strength with all their might, preparing for the grand war that would inevitably erupt and determine the ownership of their territories. Chapter 29:31. After brewing for a while, the war finally broke out. The main body of the war was naturally between Luo Fan and the world's will. After all, compared to these two, the territory occupied by the incarnation of the former world's will, which was the third party, was far too small. Although it was known as one of the three parties, in terms of territory, the former world's will side was simply not enough. Although the former world's will's incarnation was not targeted, it was not easy for it either. Although the main body of the war was the other two parties, since it was one of the three parties, it was naturally impossible for Luo Fan and the world's will to ignore it. Even if their true targets were each other, they still divided some power to guard against the former world's will's incarnation. Compared to their overall strength, this defensive power was not much. In terms of the size of the territory, this power was enough to deal with the former world's will's territory. However, it was obvious that the former world's will's incarnation did not only rely on its own territory. The reason why the territory it occupied was so small was because it had intervened too late and did not intervene in this war that could be considered tacit understanding from the start. It did not mean that its strength was limited to this small territory. In fact, the number of spacetimes that he had created in this territory was tens of thousands of times more than what he could normally create. This was tens of thousands of times more spacetimes. Although it was not enough for its strength to become tens of thousands of times stronger than normal, it was definitely not a problem. It was definitely not a problem for it to have hundreds or thousands of times more spacetimes. Therefore, in the face of the defensive power that Luo Fan and the world's will had divided according to the size of the territory, the former world's will's incarnation was quite relaxed. If it was willing, it would not take much effort to destroy the defensive power and complete the victory of this part of the war. However, it was obvious that it could not destroy the defensive power right from the start. After all, no matter how fast it moved and how far it pushed, what could it do? The area that had changed in nature was only an area around its territory that was several times the size of its territory. In other words, no matter how fast he moved and how great the advantage he obtained, before the karma of war was truly established, his territory could only expand to the area around him that was several times the size of his original territory. Even if he completed the expansion of his territory on the first day, he could only watch helplessly in the following battles, even if it took thousands of years, without being able to interfere at all. What the final form of karma would look like completely depended on how the process of constructing the karma was. Since that was the case, then as long as the process of constructing the karma was accepted by everything in the world, accepted by the river of karma, and made it believe that the entire process was the way it was now, then the final karma would definitely be formed according to what Luo Fan knew. Under such circumstances, the true relationship between the incarnation of the former will of the world and the will of the world was obviously of little significance to Luo Fan. This was still the result of everything being under the control of the world's will. In reality, it was almost impossible for the real situation to proceed according to the world's will's will. Even if what the world's will said was true, even if the world's will and the former world's will incarnation were putting on an act at the beginning, and were purposely showing discord and conflict in front of Luo Fan. However, as time passed, and they gradually split up, it was very likely that the originally non-existent conflicts and fake conflicts would really take shape after 1,000,000 years. After all, it was not easy to hide it from Luo Fan. Since it had completely hidden it from him, it meant that even if not all of the conflicts between them were real, a large part of them was real. Most of these true contradictions, given enough time to develop, would definitely allow the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth to truly stand against the will of the heavens and earth. Before this, Luo Fan's guess was just a guess. Now that the World's Will was talking to him directly, it obviously proved this point. If it was really as the World Will said, why would the World's Will need to appear here to doubt Luo Fan and stop him from cooperating with the former World's Will? If everything was going according to the World's Will's plan, then what was the point of the World's Will saying such a thing at this time? If Luo Fan believed him and fell out with the former World's Will and did not cooperate, wouldn't he lose a chance to plot against Luo Fan? If Luo Fan did not believe him and planted a seed of doubt in his heart, then wouldn't it be a big trouble for him to plot against Luo Fan in the future? Therefore, at this moment, the will of the heavens and earth had directly spoken to him. Clearly, it had indirectly confirmed Luo Fan's conjecture, allowing him to confirm that no matter what the previous incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth was now standing opposite to the will of the heavens and earth. What a pity! The surrounding voices came again, and then the original chaos, or rather, the natural state was restored. However, he could no longer hear any other words. At this time, he suddenly felt an indescribable pressure appear from nothingness. Then, the figure of a middle-aged man directly formed with the help of the pressure and appeared not far away from Luo Fan. That was the former World's Will's avatar, which was also the individual that was formed by the power that took form in Luo Fan. Looks like you've been monitoring this place at all times. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Isn't that only natural? Don't tell me you haven't been monitoring my entire territory at all times. We're in the middle of a war right now. The middle-aged man smiled and said. The middle-aged man that appeared at this time was only a projection formed by a bit of pressure. He was not even an avatar. As for his real body, it was still hidden in some unknown place in this world. Although Luo Fan wanted to confirm the middle-aged man's location, he still wisely gave up on this thought. The will of heaven and earth was the ruler of this world, the consciousness of this world, yet it had no way of finding the specific location of this middle-aged man. He had even encountered layers of shackles and restrictions here. So how could he surpass the will of heaven and earth and lock onto his true location? It was better to save some energy and do less useless things. So, what are you planning to achieve by appearing here now? Luo Fan asked with a faint smile, not dwelling on the issue of monitoring. This was just a very ordinary void dojo, although it had gradually developed all sorts of mysteries because it had been here for more than 1,000,000 years. It was ultimately just a void dojo. For the living beings in the space-time created by the three factions, this was a place that could only be seen but not reached. In fact, only true powerhouses could see this void dojo. However, for existences like Luo Fan and the others, there was not much of an obstacle. If they wanted to, it would not be difficult for them to directly monitor this place. The incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth had completely locked onto the movements here and clearly knew everything that was happening here. Although this made Luo Fan, who couldn't sense anything, feel slightly surprised, it wasn't a big deal. Of course, it's cooperation. This time, let's tear off a large piece of territory from him. The reason why the wars over the years have not had much effect on the karma construction is perhaps because the outcome of the war has not been clear, the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. His words were filled with an indescribable ambition, and his boldness was so grand that it could shake people's hearts. Of course, this was nothing to Luo Fan. I feel that the reason the karma construction has not had much effect is because of your participation, Luo Fan said. Perhaps, but I have already participated. You can't possibly risk everything turning into bubbles to get rid of me, right? The avatar of the former worlds will said calmly. It was not an impossible task to get rid of the avatar of the former world's will. If Luo Fan and the worlds were willing to stop fighting each other in the next war and focus all their power on the territory of the avatar of the former world's will, they would definitely be able to completely destroy the avatar of the former world's will. At the very least, they would be able to force its true body to take the initiative. If that was the case, it would not have the right to participate in the karma construction. However, once that happened, the balance that they had worked hard to maintain for over 1,000,000 years would be completely destroyed. When that time came, the embryonic form of the karma that showed faint signs of taking shape would completely collapse. Obviously, this was not something that Luo Fan or the worlds was willing to accept. Therefore, no matter how dissatisfied they were with the avatar of the former world's will, they still had to give it a glimmer of hope so that it could continue. This was the reason why the avatar of the former world's will was so calm. Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Of course not. However, there are many methods that can be used in a war. We don't necessarily have to completely get rid of you to achieve our goal. The prerequisite is that you can convince him." The avatar of the former worlds will interrupted and stated the premise that Luo Fan did not mention. Indeed, there were many methods in a war that could isolate the avatar of the former world's will from the main battlefield. However, this kind of isolation required the full cooperation of Luo Fan and the world's will to achieve the goal. Obviously, it was impossible for Luo Fan and the world's will to cooperate. The reason why Luo Fan and the world's will could have such a tacit understanding to construct this karma was because they wanted to break the original stalemate. The worlds will wanted to make use of this karma to bypass the power related to the true divine and devour the territory that Luo Fan occupied, so that Luo Fan could return to his original helpless state and be completely suppressed. Therefore, he needed to construct this karma. And Luo Fan needed this karma even more. After all, if he didn't have such karma, then he would be facing this boundlessly vast world that was countless times larger than the world he could deal with. Even if he worked hard for billions of trillion years, he might not be able to deal with such an enemy. In the end, he might have to think of a way to activate the power that was related to the true divine and use a method that was close to perishing together with the enemy. Only then would he be able to destroy the world. And once this cause and effect was formed, then the originally incomparably shocking size of the world would be completely transformed into another form, and it would become the outcome of many battles. Something that was illusory would become something that could be grasped. In this case, it was obviously more meaningful to Luo Fan. It was precisely because the construction of this karma was so meaningful to both of them that they had a tacit understanding to construct this karma together. Without this common effect, the conflict between them would probably be enough for them to fight to the death the moment they met. Under such circumstances, how could they work together? Even if it was something like getting rid of the incarnation of the former world's will, it was not enough for them to put aside their conflict and work together without any ill feelings. Of course, more importantly, the participation of the incarnation of the former worlds was the result of their conscious control. Now, it was naturally impossible for them to completely overturn their original decision because of such a small matter and directly work together to get rid of it. At the very least, it was impossible for both of them to completely overturn their original decision at the same time. Since it was impossible for them to completely overturn their original decision at the same time, it was even more impossible for them to work together. Luo Fan did not pause for too long. After a while, he calmly discussed with the incarnation of the former worlds on how to work together. Working together with the incarnation of the former worlds was originally the biggest idea that Luo Fan had in letting it participate as a third party. Now that the time was right, of course, they would begin to act according to the original plan. Very soon, the figure of the middle-aged man had completely disappeared in front of Luo Fan. Even the inexplicable pressure had disappeared at the same time, as if it had never existed.